Tell me what they're fighting for. What they're killing for, Lord. We don't need no more now. So tell them wicked people, fire go Panday, fire go Panday. Whoa, oh Lord, I said this is the year for love. Fire go Panday, fire go Panday. Whoa, still little boy, you ain't bad at all. No, another one just gone. Boy, you beat your chest and smile. Say you's a madman. Another young boy fall. Your soul can't rest at night. Oh, you's a bad man. Bad man is a man who just defend woman and protect the young ones by any means, Lord. You ain't no bad man, boy, nah. You ain't no bad man. A real bad man just make his own decisions. He don't need anyone, he only needs God. You ain't no bad man, boy, nah. You ain't no bad man. So, sit down, rock back. Tell them I don't need no strap to defend my people from wicked and evil, whoa. So, sit down, rock back. Big man, look for a walk. You're too damn evil. If they distress my people, then fire go Panday, fire go Panday. Whoa, oh Lord, I said this is the year for love. Fire go Panday, fire go Panday. Whoa, still little boy, you ain't bad at all. No, tell me what they're fighting for. What they're killing for, Lord. We don't need no war now. There's no need. So tell me what they're fighting for. What they're killing for, Lord. We don't need no war now. I said we don't want no more now. A real bad man don't go wrong raping woman, influencing young ones to kill a boy, nah. He ain't no bad man, boy, nah. He ain't no bad man. A real bad man works for whatever he wants, and he don't need no gun, he full of joy now. That is a bad man soldier. He ain't no bad man. So, sit down, rock back. Tell them I don't need no strap to defend my people from wicked and evil, whoa. So, sit down, rock back. Big man, look for a walk. You're too damn evil. If they distress my people, then fire go Panday, fire go Panday. Whoa, oh Lord, I said this is the year for love. Fire go Panday, fire go Panday. Whoa, still little boy, you ain't bad at all. No, tell me what they're fighting for. What they're killing for, Lord. We don't need no war now. So tell me what they're fighting for. What they're killing for, Lord. We don't need no war now. We don't want no more. What they're fighting for. What they're killing for. No. What they're fighting for. What they're killing for. No. Hysteric. I'm so tired of the screams and the cries. A tired woman living in fright. I'm so fed up of these bloody scenes where nobody care to intervene. So before it had to reach to RIP, we cleaning every stain in the community. Touch one, touch all, that's how it goes. Go and tell the world and let them know that we don't want no more talk. This ain't right. You see, I myself once was abusing life. That's why I take some of my D-Match crowd winnings and open up a house cleaning business limited. So please warn them. No, we can't no, we going for our users this year. Left foot uppercut and a swift right hand. Any woman need help, signal we like Batman. Oh, we can't take it again. We going for our abusers this year. And for all who like to do wickedness to children, I can't tell you what we have to pay for them. Oh, we can't take it again. We going for our abusers this year. Muhammad Ali ain't want nothing with They abuse the babies, some even die. People doesn't know yet, turn a blind eye. It takes a village to protect and raise a child. So you see them nasty, dirty pedophiles, them messing up the lives of our children. In the lockdown, they had a feast. Every innocent child know this. I watched my son sleep last night, and I cried, praying to God, please protect his life. Cause anybody take God out the thought, they gonna feel the real fury of this lion run. So please stop them. No, we going for our bills this year. Left foot uppercut and a good spin kick. All who hot for kids, we go change your mind quick, quick. No, we can't take it again. We going for our bills this year. To all them rich pedophiles who feel the money could save you. If we can't get you, I go to OB, I go reach you. No, we can't take it again. We going for our bills this year. I have a whole crew from south, east, west and port of Spain. Give you a zestful cocktail that you touch a child again. No, we can't take it again. We going for our bills this year. It is time we look out for one and all. So if you know a child needs saving, what? Signal what? Turn a blind eye on a child, not take. Is when a man in distress.
Come on, take a walk, gentlemen. Let's see what you got.
Should I be scared right now? So we're here in East Port of Spain, Trinidad, and when people think of Trinidad, usually they think of steel pan drums, carnival, celebrations, and good times. And Trinidad itself is a pretty rich country. They've got plenty of oil and gas deposits, and the GDP per capita here is 18,000. Unfortunately, over the past 15 years, Trinidad's seen its murder rate go from about 100 a year to 500 a year. And that's mostly due to warring gang factions in neighborhoods below me like Laventille, which fight ruthless turf wars, sometimes over just one block.
So how did these gangs get so powerful? Many of them have gotten intertwined in politics, doing favors for politicians and receiving lucrative government contracts for public works and construction projects meant to help alleviate unemployment. Adding to that, Trinidad is only 7 miles away from Venezuela. In the past few years, it has re-emerged as a major transshipment point for drugs to West Africa and the United States.
Border Patrol officers say they found 732 pounds worth of cocaine.
A recent bust in Virginia had over $100 million worth of cocaine that originated in Trinidad.
So much cocaine, we can't even tell you where we shot this video.
While the drugs only stop in Trinidad temporarily, the guns brought in as protection stay. Many on the island think that corrupt politicians and business leaders are heavily involved. And they say that this culture of corruption and impunity filters down to the street level where gangs do not fear the rule of law. We're on our way to meet Hal Greaves, a former actor now turned community activist who works with a lot of the local gangs. He's one of the few people who can move throughout all territories.
Hal, where are we right now?
We're in Canada, and this community has been devastated by the recent fighting between the gangs. Several of the families have been moved out. The buildings have been condemned. We could see where walls have been broken down. There are bullet holes all throughout the community. There was one gang there, and some years ago, the gang broke into almost 5 factions, and with murderous rage. And the boys will tell you that now, the kitchen is at war with the bedroom. And the hate they had for people who they grew up among, they shared the same house. Almost once a week, they'll be shooting in the area.
And the government's just powerless to stop it.
They're not powerless, they're just not focused.
The government has tried a number of tools to stop the violence, including curfews and anti-gang legislation passed in 2011 that carries a possible jail sentence of 20 years just for being in a gang. Most of the responsibility, though, falls on Trinidad's embattled police force, who have been criticized recently for extrajudicial killing and over-aggressive policing. We went to meet up with the Northeast Division Task Force.
So this is an Uzi that these guys pulled off a gangster about 2 nights ago. There was a shootout, and they killed 2 people. We're about to go on patrol with the Northeast Division Task Force in Trinidad, Port of Spain. From what we're told, they're sort of the baddest cops out there right now. And this is why, because they pull this off people that
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as we engage in our discussion on crime, a public health emergency, and how will it affect you. You know, we have a great lineup of panelists, very eager and educated on the topic here. So let me start off by introducing myself. I am Samantha Rampersad, your co-host for this evening, and joining me is Mr. Chris Hussain.
Thank you very much for that very short introduction, just my name, but that will work because we're working with a very interesting time slot here tonight. Well, this evening, I am very excited. It is indeed an honor and privilege to co-moderate with you this evening, Samantha, and let's just get into it. So we have a very interesting dynamic group of persons here, stakeholders, I would say, when we speak about crime and crime fighting. And so tonight we are joined by the Member of Parliament for Mayaro, the Honourable Rushton Paray. Good evening to you and welcome. We are also joined by former Commissioner of the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service, Gerard Wilson. We're also joined by Mr. Keon Cunningham. He is a social worker. We have the Honourable Senator, the Honourable Renuka Sagramsingh Sooklal. She is the Minister in the Office of the Attorney General and Ministry of Legal Affairs. Welcome. We also have Lieutenant Norman Dindial from the Trinidad and Tobago Defence Force. We also have with us the Member of Parliament for Tabaquite, Miss Anita Haynes. We also have Attorney at Law and former Member of Parliament, Miss Mickela Panday. And we have, and I just saw that she would have joined us, the Honourable Justice Lisa Ramsumair-Hinds. So welcome as well. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this interesting, very, very interesting discussion here tonight. And I hope you all are excited as I am tonight. Are you all excited? I know we are in this virtual realm right now. So everyone's speaking at the same time, maybe a bit chaotic. But you know what? Unmute. I want to hear how you all feel about tonight. You all ready?
It began with Jara, nurse to know. So I think that set the tone for me.
It's set the tone. It's set the tone. So let's start off and let's unpack a little bit. So we just would have looked at a video, and according to the video, Trinidad and Tobago has one of the highest crime rates in the Caribbean. And I want to start with you, ministers, as you were just on the floor with me. What are some of the underlying reasons for this, you think?
You're hearing me, right?
I'm hearing you.
Well, firstly, as I now officially have the platform, let me just, before I jump into addressing your question, I just want to take the opportunity, of course, to express my sincere gratitude to the Nariva Mayaro District Youth Council, of course, for hosting this very critical conversation. And I call it a conversation because, I remember in our prelude to coming onto the public platform, Member Paray would have said something very, very important. He made mention of the youths wanting to be a part of an apolitical conversation. And I must join now publicly and say to the youths of the Nariva Mayaro District Youth Council, congratulations in advance. Well, of course, no doubt it will have taken a lot of effort to orchestrate this. So congratulations and thank you most sincerely for including me as a part of the discussion. Now, all of that being said, just to be clear on the question that you ask, could you just repeat
So the video we just would have looked at got 8.7 million views on YouTube. So there's this YouTube channel, it's called Vice News, and it would have conducted a documentary in Trinidad and Tobago a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And the video would have referenced Trinidad and Tobago having one of the highest crime rates. And within the Caribbean, that is. And so I'm asking, what are some of the underlying reasons? I'm sure within the ministry, you would have been privy to a lot of information and maybe the common man on the street isn't.
And I think, I want to speak, I don't want to just speak as a politician tonight. I really want to speak as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, one, as a mother of 2 teenage children, and as a previous teacher in a previous incarnation, also as an attorney at law in a previous incarnation. And the reason why, to answer that question, we have looked, when you look at crime and you look at criminality in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure most of my colleagues on this panel may agree with me, we have to agree that criminal activity and crime is as a consequence of a multitude, and it's multifaceted. There are many factors, from the social factors, of course, the factors of poverty, the factors of unemployment. We are looking at impoverished youths. We are looking at the attraction. What attracts people to crime is the money in crime, fast money in crime, for want of a better word. Social institutions as a whole. I mean, I was a sociology student. I remember I did A-levels. And even in studying crime at that very basic level, we saw the role that multiple institutions can play one in solving crime, but equally, if they fail in their discharge of their responsibilities, whether it's the family, whether it's the church, whether it's, and by church, I mean that very broadly, the temple, the mosque, religious institutions. If the family doesn't discharge their responsibility, the church doesn't discharge their responsibility, of course, government, the executive, the legislative, the judiciary. It is when we have I don't want to say that a breakdown, but ultimately, when we have instances of persons not being able to achieve their optimal in these various institutions, I think any society, not just Trinidad and Tobago, but societies throughout the world, of course, will face high levels of criminal activity and crime.
And so the minister is telling us that it's really all of societal approach. And that is precisely why, if you look at the panel that we would have gotten here tonight, is really to treat with that. I want to go to Miss Panday. Miss Panday, what are your thoughts? What are some of the underlying reasons? Same question.
Thank you very much for having me. All protocols observed. I am honored to be in such good company, of course. Thank you very much for hosting us, my fellow panelists and those listening on social media. I want to agree with the Honourable Minister and say that, of course, crime is multifaceted, and there are many causes of crime. And I feel that you have to look at those causes. One of them, obviously, is poverty. We need, especially now in the what we would call post-COVID, if I dare say that, time, we need to address the issue, for example, of affordability. Citizens in this country cannot afford to live and are falling, therefore, into a very dangerous path of crime. We have seen crime increase tremendously since that. You would also know that it was last year, there were, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, 600 homicides recorded in that calendar year, making 2022 one of the deadliest years ever recorded. That, of course, did not happen overnight. In the past 2 decades, the country has seen an increase in violent crime. And I believe, poverty being one of the causes, the government needs to do more to create costs and lower the cost of living. Of course, we cannot deny the fact that guns need to get off the streets. There is no doubt that there's an increase in the number of murders is linked to the number of illegal guns on the street, and of course also the increase in gangs. And in fact, according to our security services, the number of illegal guns on the streets have risen from around 8,000 in 2019 to nearly 12,000 today, which is a 50% increase in illegal guns in 3 years. And then, of course, my dear friend and colleague, the Honourable Justice Haynes, will tell you that we need to do something about address the entire criminal justice system, which is in an extremely poor state. As you would know, the criminal justice system begins with the enforcement of law. when the apprehension by the police and other law enforcement officers of wrongdoers take place, followed by prosecution in the courts, followed by a fine or imprisonment or the imposition of some other rehabilitation for those found guilty. But we would have seen that what happened after COVID was where I was hoping that since things were being done virtually, we would have had some kind of decrease in the backlog of cases that seems in itself to now be completely out of control. So yeah, there are a number of factors, and I want to say that there is no magical wand that can be simply waved and crime would be solved. It will take, as the Honourable Minister has said, everybody working together. But there must be some kind of order, and by that I mean you look at it, my own personal view, in terms of detection, prevention, and rehabilitation. And there must be a holistic approach. You can't wake up one morning and say, we're going to get more police officers, or we're going to get more police stations, or we're going to get more police cars. And the entire system needs to be addressed. And in saying so, you have to therefore have short-term solutions and long-term solutions. That's my view.
A lot of interesting points are being raised here for us this evening. So I want to also allow MP Haynes to add her contribution to this, because rightfully said, last year was one of the deadliest years we've had in Trinidad and Tobago. So I'd like to pass on this question to her as well.
Thank you, Samantha. Good evening again to the fellow panelists. Good evening to the viewing audience. Allow me to just quickly join my colleagues in again thanking you all for hosting this panel and giving space for the youth of Trinidad and Tobago to really take their place as agents of change in Trinidad and Tobago. So I join my colleagues in congratulating you for a wonderful panel. Just coming off what Ms. Panday said, and indeed the Honourable Senator as well, look, there are two things we're facing. We understand that a lack of opportunity, an increasing gap in income and wealth in the country, where you get this disparity, where you see a version of Trinidad and Tobago that some persons are living in that others have no access to. And as Ms. Panday rightfully pointed out with her assessment of the judicial system, there is an absence of consequences for actions. And so if you live in a country where the life that you would like to live or afford seems attainable, just not through regular means, not through the school system, not through the regular job market, and you see it being achievable in some other way, and you understand that there are no real consequences to action, so that you may commit a crime, and whether you look at the detection point of view or the conviction point of view, we have remarkably low numbers on those ends. And so in Trinidad and Tobago right now, what we're facing, I think, is we seem to have an understanding, at least a theoretical or tacit understanding of the problem. What we're failing to do is implement targeted and systematic solutions. So we discuss the problems over and over, and we find all sorts of ways to really over-intellectualize some of these things. And what we need as a society, as citizens of this country, are targeted, measurable ways that we can say we are moving forward in the right direction. And until we get those, we are going to continue to be a very scared society.
Thank you so much for that. And we would now ask Mr. Norman Dindial to join in this conversation as well. We want to hear your perspective on this.
Good evening to the panel, and thank you so much for having me in this lively discussion that we're going to have this evening. As the moderator said, we're a bit short on time, so I'm going to dive straight into it. We have to look at things from a post-colonial aspect. Since we've left, Trinidad and Tobago has become independent. Our system has looked at crime and criminality to punish the individuals. we have never looked really at reintegrating the individuals back into society. Now, I agree with both and all the panelists so far, but one of the things that we have to recognize, even if the judicial system is lacking, even if our detection rate is lacking, when we have these criminal elements and we take them and we put them into a system, and I know the Commissioner of Prison is going to tell us about it. When you go into a system that is overcrowded, overpopulated, it becomes a school for hardened criminals. So we send people into the system and there is not a proper rehabilitation effort. Now, there are some programs I know that are available, but if you look at first world countries, we don't look at crime and criminality as a punishment. Post-colonial, we as Trinidad and Tobago, we have always recognized that once you get into the system, you are to be punished. But at some point in time, the individuals have to be reintegrated into society. And if they have to be reintegrated into society, they have to come out and deal with you and me, all the individuals. If they come out of this institution as a crime lord, or the things that they learned there, what do? They come back out without the ability to integrate into society, but they come out with the ability to teach individuals how to better be a crime boss, how to use the system against our individuals. So this is one of the things that when looking at crime and criminality, we have to recognize that we need to fix the system of reintegrating our individuals. Another thing that my esteemed colleagues are talking about, these things we have all known that crime is across the board. Social things has to be taken into consideration. We know education marginalizes, but these things are not new. A holistic approach of crime has always been on the table. It's only now that we are giving it a name, making the nexus and having a link. And I'm going straight, looking at crime as a public health issue. I wouldn't say risk, we'll discuss that after emergency, but crime has always been a public health issue. And we have recognized that in every single forum that we have gone to, even before. Even the Commission of Prisons, we have always known that we have to have social programs in place in crime. But there was always a lack of for the government's or previous administration's ability to focus on it. Why? So we have looked at after 1990 what has happened to our situation, and that documentary is instructive, and the documentary has shown that normally after 1990 or that coup, Trinidad and Tobago has escalated into a crime situation. Before that, we have to understand what was the elements that caused this coup. It was social unrest. In our systems, the government of the day was not providing the things for the community, for the people, health services. So there was this discontent within the community. But 1990 happened. We have insurrections. We have had these people, or I don't want to demonize the Jamaat al-Muslimi, but we have had this grouping of institutional people that have been by and largely been let off the hook. So we have now seen that right after 1990, they were let off the hook by a so-called amnesty. By the so-called amnesty, and immediately after that, these individuals were seen with political parties in the arena, going out for votes and stuff. So it has shown that governments also has legitimized a sort of behavior that is really, really bad, something that the country is still reeling from to recuperate. And then you have those institutions with these individuals in the fragmented after coup Jamaat al-Muslimi gangs, where the lieutenants have now fragmented into their different silos. So these individuals have seen it has been legitimized by government that they can go ahead and do these things. So we have a legitimacy of crime from the top going all the way down.
Now, let me say so far, and it's interesting because this documentary, obviously we would not be able to show the entire documentary because of the time constraints we're working with and the number of panelists. But the documentary actually does reference, and there were some key stakeholders involved in that documentary that did reference the coup and the effects that the coup had where it pertained to crime. But I want to bring in Justice Haynes into this conversation. I see you listening very intently. And so I would like to allow you to join in this conversation. Good evening.
Yes, good evening, everyone, panelists, and anyone else who is listening or paying attention. Yes, I listen attentively, Mr. Hussein.
Yes.
But you said you'd like me to join the conversation. I like to answer specific questions.
You're a judge, so I forgot that for a quick second. But it's interesting. So we're discussing crime and we're discussing the underlying reasons for crime. So far, they would have laid off their own case so far, as I would think they're experts within certain areas. And so you would hold a very interesting role because persons would come before you, and I guess you would get to see a different side of the element from the other panelists. So discuss with us that side that you see.
All right. Well, I could share one or two things, and perhaps in my contribution, pull from one or two of the comments that we've heard so far in terms of how it affects how I see my function in the criminal justice system. I am one of a very small bench. There are, prior to December last year, there were at any one point in time in the recent past 8 or up to 10 criminal judges sitting in the High Court. I don't think many people know that. We now have 13 criminal judges in this country. Even if a criminal judge dispensed with weekends, vacations, sick days, and sleep. We didn't pause to refresh ourselves or even eat. There is absolutely no way that the criminal justice system can do trials in order to achieve what its core function is, at least in the criminal division. And I would say my core function is I'm about the business of convicting the guilty and acquitting, hear me carefully, not the innocent, but acquitting those who cannot be proved guilty. When I put it in that context, I simplify it into its basic terms. If we are to arrest crime, it has to be in a way where the consequences can be attached to the offenses that can be proved. So, of course, clearly there's a component there in terms of not just detection, but investigation and prosecution. And those are some sore points in this country. That's a resource issue, that's a training issue, that's a will issue, and I'll say will generally. I won't attach any names or labels to the will. But I'll tell you, no matter how hard criminal judges work, we're going to be to a certain point, to a certain extent, spinning top in mud, unless, of course, we take advantage of the other initiatives. Now, Council Ms. Panday mentioned that there was a hope that during the pandemic, since we had this enhanced virtual capacity to sit, that we could have done some remarkable work to arrest the backlog. Well, I shared that hope. In fact, I started sitting during that pandemic virtually with the hope that we could do so much because we didn't have that downtime in commute, we didn't have tired people, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, no jury trials could have been conducted during the pandemic. So it was a case only of judge alone trials. That requires supporting legislation. I'm recognizing that there are some politicians on this platform, but recognizing the separation of powers, and with all due respect to those who have a remit that's different from mine, but drastically affects my ability to work. Right now in our country, the only way for a judge to do a trial without a jury is when the accused man elects to do the trial. So we were only able, Mr. Hussein, to do as many trials as we could do, where an accused elected to do the trial, to give up to forfeit the right to be tried by a jury of their peers, and that remains their right. There are other jurisdictions that have entirely dispensed with the need for jury trials, and that's an argument or a discussion for another time. But jury trials take time, they take a lot of resources, so that's one issue. The other thing is we have a lot of initiatives that unfortunately attorneys on both sides of the bar, so prosecution and defense, they don't take full advantage of. There's plea bargaining legislation, there are MSIs, etc. There are all of those initiatives that we can make use of. Now, if I push attorneys hard enough, and these days I'm getting a little bit of backlash for pushing attorneys, I make no apologies. If I push attorneys hard enough, I can get perhaps anywhere between 4 to 6 matters determined in a month, but that's not by trial alone. That includes plea bargaining and the MSI process. As to the larger argument about the causes of crime, I know my limitations and I am not an expert in that. That's a psychosocial issue. And I think perhaps Mr. Cunningham would probably be in this platform the single best person to answer that question with a little more expertise, if we can call it expertise. I think many of us on this platform, we're experts at talking and we're experts at holding a particular remit within the criminal justice system, but we absolutely have no clue what happens within the human psyche and what could make them commit a crime. I don't for a single, let me change the way I'm saying that. I do not believe that poverty by itself can be the single greatest cause of crime. We speak about guns being available on the street, and I'm sure that it's cheaper to acquire an illegal firearm than it is to lawfully acquire one. However, guns that they're available on the street. So please, let us not segregate. I think to stay at that base level.
Problems that you would have seen from your remit and from your point of view and within your work.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hussein. Sitaram, good evening. Assalamu alaikum to all my brothers and sisters from the four corners of this twin island republic of Trinidad and Tobago. I want to get into this conversation and raise some pertinent points that my fellow colleagues would have risen as well. And I want to start off in terms of poverty. We often see poverty as one of the number one factor when we speak about crime and violence. But that's just surface, just as the judge would have alluded to. Poverty is just at the surface. If we were to look at Trinidad and Tobago holistically, there are persons who face that poverty spectrum and they do not sell themselves to guns and gang violence. So this asks the question, how much of an influence does poverty play when it comes to crime and the violence that we often see in Trinidad and Tobago? Ms. Panday would have raised three major points that I took note of, which was detection, prevention, and rehabilitation. And I want to stick in the center there, that center point, prevention. Yes, we would have been speaking about preventative methods since Jesus was a baby, yet still we wouldn't have seen any sort of major changes in what we would like to see or what we would perceive as change. Then therefore again, this asks the question, how influential is preventative methods to the reduction of crime and violence? From that psychosocial perspective that the judge rules there, I believe now more than ever we need to look at humanistic behavior. That's one of the major things that I believe would help us understanding what we are dealing with, what we are facing with, what we face, and what we have in our capacity as a community, as a society, and as a nation. My fellow colleague also rose the point about reintegration. That's very, very, very fundamental in our society at this very moment, because most of the times we tend to miss that step in terms of how reintegration works and how rehabilitation works. As a collective society, we barely look at rehabilitative methods when persons have to be re-intervened in society when they run afoul of the law. A bit later down in the conversation, I will touch in terms of intervention strategies that the government would have put in place, especially the Ministry of National Security. We had Project Reason, which transformed itself into Project Building Blocks, which is for a fact a public health approach when it comes to reducing guns and gang violence. Yeah.
All right, so we've had some really interesting perspectives thus far. The conversation is conversing, and I love it. But you know, Justice Haynes spoke about that 2.5 turn. I think it's at 2.5, and I have to say, I think I'm the SpongeBob in the group because I can't drive. I'm currently in the process of that, so I'm here now wondering what is this? But I know my hand signals. I think that's a few brownie points. But Chris, could you drive?
I can drive, but not 25 points, so maybe 8, but you know.
I'm so confused. I don't even know what's the difference, but we know to follow the signs that we see on the road, so you won't be catching me in no illegal acts. I have to say though, you know, Chris and I, in preparation for this, we've been having a lot of conversations, and very often we hear young people saying that we need to hold our leaders accountable. We don't hear from them, and we play this blame game. We know how society operates. You know, everybody points fingers at each other, but the real question is, where do we go from here, and how do we move forward, and how do we hold ourselves accountable as well? Because I'm pretty sure most of us here know almost every gunman song I'd have to sing in Trinidad, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we would, you know, portray the act. I myself am guilty, you know, of listening to it. We know it, but as young people, we have to say that we are really thankful to you all for making the time to come and sit with us this evening to have this discussion and to really give us some sort of guidelines as to where do we go from here. And the 1990 coup d'etat attempt was brought up, which is something we're interested in diving a bit into. But before we do that, we would like to introduce the second part of our video by Vice, and then we'll dive back into this discussion.
There is a perpetual quest for dominance. You go to sleep Friday night and the person that was dominant Friday, Saturday morning, they find him dead. Then it starts all over again, and the instability starts all over again, and the war for power starts all over again.
Without Bakr or another strongman in power, different leaders are doing whatever is necessary to assert control over territory and contracts.
The gangs have been enshrined in the consciousness of communities. The gangs play a very strategic role when it comes to the distribution of wealth in our communities. And a lot of our communities have felt neglected for a very long time from government. So they're not getting the jobs from government. They're not getting the kind of resources they want from the government. But somehow the gangs seem to be the government in our communities. And in Trinidad and Tobago, they don't call themselves gangs. They see themselves more as community groups, more as organizations, more as community leaders. These are the leaders of the community who are receiving these contracts from government to provide the kind of jobs. It could be payback for getting the votes as well. They see themselves as business organization, and that business can run from government contracts to drugs. It's whatever is the big business on the street today, and they're going to get involved in that. No business passes them by.
We had
All right, so that was a very interesting video. I want to hear what MP Paray has to say on this. The Member of Parliament for Mayaro. And when I say I want to hear what you have to say about in response to that video, it referenced that gangs and communities are being neglected by the government. It also would have referenced that perhaps there's some sort of payback through contracts and without getting into legal issues, because this may have the potential to do that. And I certainly would not like anyone to get sued. But as an opposition MP, you sit on the other side of the house, you're within the minority, and there are bills that come before Parliament that you will support some, you will do not support some. The anti-gang legislation would have been one of them, which I would like for us to get into. But my first question to you would be, what is your response to that video where it would have referenced government contracts and neglect?
Well, thank you again for having me, and very good evening to all colleagues who are with us on the panel this evening. And I'm going to quote 48.1 in the standing orders, that I will not repeat anything that anyone has said so far. But what I can tell you that in this country, we're suffering from paralysis by analysis, I think. There has been 1 million studies over the last 15 or 20 years in terms of the causes of crime, the actions. I mean, I think Professor Dave Saran, Professor Selwyn Ryan, Darius Figaro, and a whole bunch of other guys have done so much work over the years, have done so much of presentations to government. And when I say government, I'm not pointing any particular government. We're talking about government in general over the last 20 or 30 years. So there is nothing new that causes crime today that caused crime 20 years ago. There is one thing that I think Madam Justice spoke about concerning the link between poverty and the supposedly attachment to crime. And I want to agree with her. If you look at the 1990s, when we had the oil boom and you had money flowing, you had a certain level of crime in line with what was happening with the economy. And as the economy bows and slows down, you see the same type of crime and criminal activity. So I would want to agree that there is less connection between poverty and crime than what you have with social inequity and social inequality that is a driver for crime in this country. The other thing that I want to just hint, I know Commander Dindial, he referenced his position in terms of crime being a public health emergency. And I know the Honourable Prime Minister had made that position as well some time ago in terms of, how he saw the treatment of crime, and it has to be looked at from a public health perspective. Now, while I would probably agree from the effect side that it will have negative impacts on physical and mental health of individuals and communities, in my respectful view, crime is primarily illegal and social issue that must be dealt by law enforcement agencies, by the justice system, from the police, from intelligence gathering to evidence-based, to prosecution, to going to the courts, to going into the prison system, to rehabilitation, to bring you back out into the community. My respectful view is that that entire chain has collapsed over the years. And the question that you ask, as sitting as an opposition MP, this is my 6.5 year in the Parliament. And I can tell you there has been significant amount of legislation that we in the opposition have supported the government over the years. They have some that we have had to have a particular stand on. And I would just like to reiterate the function very, very quickly of the opposition. Our function is not to rubber stamp anything that the government brings. Our function is to look at the legislation, identify kinks, loopholes, and bring it to the attention of the state, of the government, of the Parliament. And if the government agrees with us, then they fix it. If they don't agree with us, they let it go through and they pass it with whatever has simple majority and so on. But we look specifically at constitutional issues, especially in the 3/5 majority legislation. Where does it affect the man on the street? And then understanding that law in Trinidad and Tobago has to be developed in mind with our cultural nuances as well. right? So sometimes there's a lot of legislation that comes, and while it will work perfectly in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and in Canada, we look at our cultural nuances here and we raise these matters as matters of concern. So some of them, I know the red flag legislation, like the anti-gang bill, they had issues around bail legislation and so on, that were a bit controversial that, we wouldn't, discuss here in terms of the argument. Suffice to say that a mature political system will find a way forward on all these bills. And whether that, I can say now that we are mature to a point politically where parties can come and sit and find middle grounds. It started to work in the 11th Parliament. I think it has gone crazy in this Parliament. That's something we need to work on as a parliamentary system, but it requires a certain level of maturity on the participants inside it. And I will tell my constituents from time to time that we are a young nation. We are having teething problems. We are finding our space in the world. There are democracies that are 200 and 300 years old that have a lot more problems than us. But these teething problems that we are having is good. And the more dialogue we have and the more programs like this we have, and our young audience can chime in their views and help us find that way forward, we will find a way forward as a country. So I will tell them, do not lose hope. Do not lose hope in your leaders. Do not lose hope in the system of politics. I will tell young people, you do not have to pick a side in politics, but it's important you have an opinion in politics. Yeah, a political opinion is very, very important because politics, it takes the garbage out of your house. So you cannot divorce yourself from it as well. So, I mean, at the end of the day, crime is a very complex issue. And as I said, that chain that has collapsed, I know Madam Justice recently had to be a bit stern with the DPP office as reported in the newspaper. You have resource issues. I mean, you have people staying 10 years in remand yard, where you convert a man who may not necessarily be a hardened criminal into a hardened criminal just waiting for a trial. You have resourcing issues in the police service, in terms of converting intelligence to evidence. So that whole chain has had some issues. And I think you need the political will, you need the resources to target it and, work on them. And finally on this, discipline cannot be done in the charge room. Discipline cannot be done in the principal's office. Discipline has to be done in the living room of the home. So that social component, which is very, very critical, I think that is where the vast majority of the work has to happen. And I've traveled to Beijing in 2017 and I studied a project that they have where they moved 1.2 million people out of poverty in Shanghai. And the system by which they did it, it was amazing. And it's something that we can copy if we have to. But again, you need political will, you need resources, you need discipline. I think someone spoke about the lack of discipline in terms of a society. I think that is one of the biggest challenge we have. If you don't like your leaders, if you don't like your politicians, if you don't like your judges and magistrates, if you don't like your police officers, if you don't like your teachers, I can tell you we're not importing them from Barbados or Jamaica or Guyana. They are coming from the communities. And if you do not like what you see at the top, the solution lies in the communities that is rearing these individuals. So we need to start internally. Keon has, and his grouping of people have one of the biggest challenges, I feel, in terms of getting us somewhere where we can see over time a reduction in the volume, the numbers, and the type of criminal activities in this country. So I'll leave it there.
I also want to bring in former commissioner to this conversation. Yes, you're still with us. So we would have just looked at a video very, very controversial. And I want to warn the panel, because we are going to be turning up the heat a little bit after former commissioner finished giving his sorts of opening remarks still. And I'm just giving you a little warning. So yes, Mr. Wilson.
All right, thank you very much. And let me say I'm happy, I'm really pleased to be included in this August group. the Nariva team, and I'm happy to contribute. Let me say that first, let me start with a very controversial statement. When someone saw the little ad that was sent out, they asked me whether it was a political group. And that is one of the problems we are having, that we have to remove politics. If we need to look at country, we have to remove the politics if we're looking at crime and criminality. Commander Dindial said something, and so much has been said on the topic that I'll just move it to the prisons, and I'll tell you why. When you look at, I would have spent almost 36 years in the prison service. So I would have sat down and interacted with a lot of those persons who we would consider, persons committing the most heinous crimes and what have you. And when you sit and speak with them, you realize that circumstances is really, really a problematic issue, because we talk about, to me, the socio-economic factors are really important when we look at crime. Because, and we're not saying that we could have the nature debate and whether the individual corrupts the environment or the environment corrupts the individual. We could do that. So I am not saying that it's totally poverty, but I'm saying that what happens in sociology is we versus them. They form subcultures. So when these young persons sit on the block, what they do is group themselves in, this is us, and we have to fight against them. How are we getting into these communities to try to change the mindset? So when I sit and speak with those persons when I worked in the prison service, and you sit and speak with them, you realize they feel that everybody else is the enemy. How do we get to them, right? How do we have that conversation? And the important thing is that crime, to me, I would continue to say this, is everybody's business, and it starts, to me, it starts with the community. So we have to get into the communities and see what is happening there. Now, countries that are data-driven are countries, to me, that succeed. I'll tell you why. If we go back 10, if we take a 10-year period and we go back, you ask yourself, those young men, and I go with the men in particular because those are the persons who are committing most of the crimes. If we go back, if we take a 10-year period and we ask ourselves, what has happened to those young men who would have left secondary school without a single pass? Let's track them. Let's trace them for the last 10 years. What is happening with them? Then you would also hear that, okay, there are opportunities out there, there are schools, there are centers where these people can go. But how do we attract them to these centers is another thing. So we have to find ways to get them into these learning centers. Then you also have the issue of, I cannot go in this particular area, I cannot go in that area, so how do I access the facilities for me to do anything, right? Somebody spoke earlier about this instant gratification among young people. Young people want something now. They don't want to have to work too long for that. So what is the attraction? The attraction, of course, would be the so-called community leaders that they see driving the fancy cars and living a particular lifestyle, right? And I can tell you that the negative things are very easy to follow. Young people love to follow negatives. It attracts them. So that for you to tell a young man, okay, do masonry or do carpentry, if he's not, so academically inclined, he will say, why must I do that? When the guy down the road, he didn't go to school, but he's driving a BMW or a Mercedes Benz. He has a lot of money. Why should I fight to do this when I can get my money through drugs and what have you? So that, to me, our focus, we have to look at the solutions to crime, yes, but we have to spend more time looking at what are the causes of crime. So we have to start to attract young people to a different lifestyle. And how do we do that? I am saying, and this is something that Judge Haynes can probably look at. What I'm saying is that in the prison service, programming is not compulsory. So persons are committed to prison, but it is not compulsory for them to do programming. It is not compulsory for them to get into programs. So how do we change them while we have the time to do it. Because a lot of them would start to do, would do CXC, will do school even, what have you, because now they have the time. But because it is not compulsory, they come into the system, they sit there, and then they leave just as blank as they came. So I am thinking that the judiciary may have to look at sentencing persons with compulsory programming. Also, because our remand system is unique in the sense that because they spend such a long time in remand, we can imagine somebody spending 13, 14 years in remand and they are not exposed to programming. If you're not exposed to programming, it's 14 wasted years. So let's work on them. It could be anger management, it could be drug addiction issues, what have you. Let's work on them while we have them in the institution, so that when they leave, they could rejoin society, probably, I'm not saying, fully changed, but at least halfway there. So in my view is that we have to start a look at reformation and rehabilitation, the softer skills in a more tangible way.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Minister, I think she's with us. Yes, she is with us still. I know it's a large panel. Minister, the former commissioner, he is referencing the lack of data. And in the previous budgets, the government would have presented several allocations for the Statistical Institute. Where are we with that and providing the data for these policies?
From the point of the legislation, remember, we are still, that piece of legislation, of course, I can't speak out of turn because it's still currently, it is priority on our legislative agenda, recognizing, of course, every policy that transcends ministry relies on data. One, there is the political will, I will say, for us to drive this legislation, but it is a piece of legislation that requires a special majority. I know Member Paray, MP Paray would have spoken about data and special majority issues that the opposition would usually champion or they would deal with when bills are brought to the parliament. Now, I'm saying that because in the bill that is currently for consideration by the LRC, which is the Law Review Commission and so on, of course, paramount in that bill or critical in that bill is our consideration of those special majority issues, because you're looking at tapping into data, personal information. And I recognize that it's young people on the platform, so I'm going to speak as simply as possible so that at least persons who are not lawyers too can also follow along, right? You're looking at the collection of data, the bill that we have. I will say there is the political will, but of course, to pass this bill will require a special majority, because you're talking about a legislation that, of course, is going to traverse and is going to be critical in the collection of data, and is going to touch and concern almost every single aspect, every single facet of society. So what you would find, what has happened currently is that that bill is still currently before the Law Reform Commission, the LRC, the Legislative Reform Committee, in which paramount, or one of the major considerations, is, of course, settling that those majority issues that comes up in the bill. Of course, we are also in the process of continuing consultation as it relates to driving the legislation forward. What I also want, especially the young persons listening in, when we talk about legislation and passing legislation, I mean, and to be very honest, this is something that I was only exposed to now based on where I sit. You know, you're a young lawyer, we deal with the end product, which is the legislation. You go to a court. I was a defense counsel, so of course you're looking for lacunas and you're championing a cause as a defense lawyer. It was for the very first time sitting in the office of the Attorney General as a minister here, you really consider, I mean, we go to law school and there are other lawyers on the platform, and I me personally, I can speak for me, like to a great extent, you take for granted what involves or what is involved in creation of legislation. Sitting where I sit now, you recognize that, of course, the process is not as simple as it appears to the naked eye. And sitting where I sit now and linking it back to the question that you asked about the legislation. Remember, there are processes. Of course, I often hear the concern about time and what could take so long. But taking long, sometimes we require that necessary time because one, consultation has to happen. Sometimes what you have is that consultation may take place and then you may have key stakeholders changing the goalposts. So you have to return to the drawing board as it relates to the redrafting of those that said legislation. And I can speak to that because of where I sit now. Before as a defense counsel, before as a practitioner of the law, you look and you complain. I myself would have complained, whether it's administration upon administration. I mean, why isn't this law passed? Why isn't this amendment brought? But sitting where I sit now, I have a greater understanding of the processes involved, especially if we want to create legislation where we allow stakeholders to have a voice, especially if we want to create legislation where everybody can play a part in creating, and that's the stakeholder consultation part of it. Of course, after stakeholder consultation is completed, then we would, of course, revert those comments and queries to our CPC department, which are now the drafters of the law. And that too will take some time. So, I mean, I just wanted to put on the record, just very simply, some of the processes that goes behind the scene of the creation of this legislation. Certainly, I can say from a government perspective, there is the political will to have this piece of legislation brought to our parliament at the soonest possible time. However, I saw you wanted to interject.
Yeah, because what I want to ask, maybe a follow-up, is the timeline, because this would have been on previous budgets of the administration right now. I believe way back since 2017.
Correct. But remember, even if we have a budgetary allocation, which is given, of course, the law is critical in, of course, the operationalization of any National Institute for Statistics and so on. So the law is where we have to continue. That's where we have to continue the work relative to the legislation. I cannot give a timeline. And the reason for that is because, of course, certainly I won't commit myself to a timeline. But what I can say, and coming back to where, Member Paray, MP Paray spoke about political will. There is the political will to have this legislation brought to our parliament at the soonest possible time. But it's also just for us to understand that it's a process, and it is currently before our LRC for consideration. We are also simultaneously conducting the stakeholder consultations on the necessary legislation. Critical to this piece of legislation, the passage of this legislation, of course, is the special majority issue, which is certainly something that we do not take lightly. And all in all, I hope that addresses to some extent your concern.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Minister. I see we have two hands up. I saw MP, you would have raised your hand. So I'll go with the legislators first and then go to the judiciary. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. And just a quick interjection here. Data-driven policy is a very, it's a part of my political life in a way that I entered doing, my background is in political science, and I entered doing monitoring and evaluation, data analytics and statistics on that end, right? And I can just say, I know you asked the question specific to the Statistical Institute and the legislation, but the creation of an institute does not preempt us from collecting, collating, and using data to drive policies with or without the existence of the institute. And I'll give an example, because what Mr. Wilson said is was so important to how we think about our treatment of society. Over the COVID-19 pandemic, at a joint select committee, we heard a report that some 47,000 students never accessed online education. That is that they didn't come online one time, not that they accessed, that they were on and off, or it was periodical. They never accessed online education. So we had that statistic. Coming out of the pandemic, asking a question as to how many of that 47,000 students have re-entered the system. So that way we can track if they've dropped out of the education system altogether, if they're back into the education system, and then the suggestion that I would have given was that Ministry of Education use the school data, which is available. You do not need a statistical institute to access that data. You use the information at the social welfare department. You know the social workers within the schools who know whether or not students are attending school or not. And then you come together and you figure out whether or not these students are left of the system, so that when Mr. Wilson is talking about persons who weren't able to complete a CXC certificate 10 years ago, and if they have no passes where they are now, we can start right now to see whether or not those students who were not accessing education during the pandemic, if they are back in the system, and prevent a problem 10 years from now. And so while we get into a space where we discuss legislation and we discuss all of these things, at the end of the day, there are policies, there are policy drivers that can be done without the work of the parliament necessarily coming into this space. And then when you do those things, parliament assists you along the path, but there are things that can be done. And I think when we think about data and we think about data-driven policy, it allows us as a society to set manageable targets so that we can then evaluate if what we are spending money behind, if what we are putting time behind, effort where we can evaluate our investments and say, okay, this is working, this may not be working, we can tweak this, we have to cut this, and therefore you say to a population who I hope, and Mr. Wilson, I heard you say we have to remove politics from the conversation, but I think the practice of politics has made that statement something that we like to use, but politics is simply a vehicle for public policy. And if we understand that politicians ought to give you, the population, what policies we intend to enact to get the changes you want, then you'll understand that we have to keep the politics. What we don't have to do is keep the manner in which the politics may have played out over different years. But the politics is still important because it's a vehicle for public policy. It is the vehicle for change. It is a vehicle for us to discuss what can we do differently, either in a big way, a small way, in the short term, medium term, long term, and then we get the things right. We fix what's not working. We get rid of what's not working. We fix what can be fixed, but we do so using data from all available spaces, things that we have, and if we can, when we get the institute or the statistical institute on board, all well and good, amazing, but until then, there are absolutely things that can be done.
Thank you, MP. I want to go to Judge Haynes.
Yes, thank you for acknowledging me, Mr. Moderator. I have to seek the leave of the fellow panelists and the moderators, organizers. I did indicate to Mr. Bidisi that I had overlapping commitments today, so I'd be leaving you early. So I'll make my contribution now, and then I must apologize, but I have to take my leave. I mean no discourtesy to anyone here. This is certainly a distinguished panel. And hopefully you all have more conversations like this. Perhaps a panel that's not quite so big, so you could get into the meat of it. When you have this wealth of experience, it's difficult to give everyone a chance to speak. I can tell you we are all sort of biting our tongues right now. We would love to raise our hands, enable our mics. We all have something to say. I promise you, you see calm faces, but we all have something to say to jump in. I'm sure I said that for everybody here, especially the lawyers. But I wanted to just stick a pin on two things. I don't want to speak to the legislation about statistics, etc., but to speak about the legislation and make a point in relation to crime and disorder a little bit more generally. There is a process for laws to be made. It's a very involved one, and you need both sides. For effective legislation, you need both sides, and it needs to be robustly addressed. You need consultation. Apart from all of that, when you get to the point of a good piece of legislation on the books and in force, and we do have in recent times, we have had many, many successful processes, running the full gamut of everything that is involved, back and forth, fixing, tweaking as it should be to get good law. If you don't have effective resources in place or structures in place for the operationalization of the laws, then it's not going to work. In addition, so I say that in relation, for example, to all of the legislation that was passed in relation to addressing children in conflict with law in particular. The very start of the implementation of those provisions met with a bigger flaw in the operationalization. So the courts were only empowered to send children or place children in conflict with the law in certain institutions. The government would have successfully passed good law. It was very good law, but there was no facility in place for us to send them. So the courts, you make good law, it will help the government. It was policy. It would help the society. Sorry, it was policy driven. It was really good. It still is good law. But without putting the things in place, you create a bigger mess if you're not careful. And we've had quite a lot of civil suits in relation to that inability to properly operationalize law. And that by itself is a learning curve for us as a young society. But I'm not going to speak to the substantive issue because it's not relevant to the conversation. It's just that you must understand laws alone, passing laws alone is not enough. You must be able to operationalize it. The other thing is, and this is taking us to another piece of legislation that's also good. We amended and updated our domestic violence legislation, for example, not so long ago. Again, we have a very, very solid domestic violence act right now. It's not perfect, but it's very, very good. And yet we still can't seem to stem the tide of gender-based violence. Laws by themselves are not enough. It's just not enough. I join with a fellow panelist in saying discipline is not restricted to police stations or schools or principals' offices, but it must be inculcated in the home. I will add, though, that the first place you see a gap in instilling discipline in the home is in the classroom. So as you know, the long time adage, it takes a village to raise a child. I don't know why we stopped thinking that. And then somehow we expect that a judge is going to be able to sit down in the Hall of Justice and fix a problem that we all had a hand in and a responsibility to play in the raising and treating of someone, simply because you will face dire circumstances or any government of the day hasn't created enough opportunities for you and you find yourself in a quagmire of issues involving poverty and lack of opportunity. That by itself does not inform the exercise of choice to do right or wrong. That's a human thing that we have to teach. I did not come from luxury. I grew up in the very poor part of La Romaine in South Trinidad. We did not have indoor plumbing. I saw police officers running through my yard, jumping over my own fence to get after whoever they were looking after while I was sitting down doing my homework. That's how I was cultured. I made choices. So every single one of us, and I'm glad this is a platform for young people, it's too easy to accept rhetoric as excuses. And I have to leave you with that. Please, I'm sorry if I come across too harsh. I can't help it. But it really was a privilege to be here with you all. This is not the end of your conversation, I know, but please forgive me and allow me to take your leave, all of you. And do have a wonderful evening.
Take care, Madam Justice. Take care.
Yes, it was a pleasure.
Have a good evening, Madam Justice.
Yes, take care, everyone. I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Justice Haynes, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening and for your contributions. So we recognize Senator Sagramsingh. Sooklal, you wanted to add to the contribution?
Yeah, it was just a brief. I just wanted to springboard out of a comment made by MP Haynes, which is a very, very important contribution. You know, MP Haynes spoke about in the absence of the institute in order to acquire statistics, how critical it is for us to tap into other avenues in which we can acquire necessary data in order for us to drive and for us to be able to create policies which then transcends into legislation. And I have to agree with MP Haynes. And as a matter of fact, that is what we have had to do in the absence of the Institute, and is what, at least from the Office of the Attorney General point of view, at least from the Office of the Attorney General, what we have been doing in order to assist, of course, the creation of policies which then translates into legislation. So for example, and you see, it comes back again to when I spoke about the importance of stakeholder consultation. In the absence of any institute where one centralized organization, which all the statistics and all the data is held, that is exactly the process, and that speaks to the importance of consultation, because in the absence of having the data available, for example, if we are passing a piece of legislation as it relates to, let's say, bail amendments, or when we were doing the anti-gang legislation, if we're looking at firearm legislation, in the absence of the institute, of course, that's where we tap into what data we can get from the police service, what we can get from the prison service. If you're looking at a piece of legislation, let's say driven from the Ministry of Education, there are systems in place, of course, in the Ministry of Education, no doubt, where they can turn to in order to be able to access that data. So yes, I know in my contribution, I would have spoken generally about the process and what it involves before we can actually reach to having a fixed legislation that will speak to data collection. But in the absence, please understand, and just for the purpose of the record, every legislation, in the absence of the said institute, as MP Haynes would have alluded to, that is exactly what as responsible legislators, that is exactly what as the responsible, whether it's opposition or government, which we have had to do. So please understand that even in the absence of that said institute, there are avenues available to us. And it was just to make that simple point, to agree with MP Haynes, speaking to, of course, whether it's a GSC, whether it's a Joint Select Committee, data that comes out of that. And as I would have alluded to, whether it's from the prison service, whether it's from the police service, because no doubt recognizing and agreeing with the member, the MP, how critical, of course, that data is relative to the creation of policy, which then translates and finds itself in legislation.
All right, and Mr. Cunningham, we see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. I must agree with MP Haynes in terms of how important data, collection of data is. I know for a fact that from the OPM perspective, and I commend Mr. Webster Roy on the National Child Registry, I know that now is a central database for ensuring that children developmental needs, whether they face disability, cognitive learning, whatever it is, that is one of the central focal points of moving forward in our Twin Island Republic. And I know it's one of the first kind in the Caribbean, that NCR, National Child Registry. So I look for what the future holds with that being a fundamental point there in terms of collecting that data so that we would have it to do that sort of tracking, so we wouldn't be lost as to where someone is 10 years from now when they do CXT. We could look at the data and have a clear understanding as to where they fell and what we can do to reintegrate them back into society. Also, too, I want to touch on a very, very important point that the former commissioner made in terms of going into the communities and understanding and changing behavior. With respect to the both organizations that I mentioned, Project Reason, which transformed itself into Project Building Blocks, which would have ended last year, December. Project Reason from 2014 to 2017 would have seen a 40% reduction in woundings, shootings, and murders in East Port-au-Prince. So that's communities such as Sealots, Lavantil, Beetham, St. Paul Street, you name it. Once you were in the East Port-of-Spain and environs, they would have seen a 40% reduction in those things, transforming itself into project building blocks now, as I mentioned prior to, which is basically a public health approach in dealing with crime and gun violence. Now, what that basically is and what project building blocks tend to do is they follow a three-pronged approach as it relates to that public health disease, because we see it as a disease in project building blocks. Just as we have COVID-19, you need intervention strategies to help fight such a disease. And a perfect example would be for COVID-19, an intervention strategy would have been wearing your mask, washing your hands. So too, we need to find intervention strategies when dealing with crime and gang violence. So as I said, project building blocks would have taken up a three-prong approach, which basically the first one, as Ms. Panday would have mentioned, detection. And I must add, in the project building blocks realm, there are violence interrupters and outreach workers. And the beautiful thing about this organization is that you know sort of educational background, academics, you don't need those things. All you need, as we say, is a QBE, which is qualified by experience. So there are persons who literally work with us, who are from the communities, who understand the hardships of the community, so they can better analyze what needs to be intervened and what needs to be done from that standpoint. So the first one, as I say, is detect and interrupt the transmission of violence. So this is where our violence interrupters would come in. Persons who work in the communities 24/7. They can shoot a call and say, hey, here is the scene. Before you shoot it out, let's talk it out. These are the sort of intervention strategies. They do mediation, conflict resolution, and those are the things that are needed when we are dealing with crime and violence from a perspective where we want to understand the root cause, because sometimes the root cause can really be a simple miscommunication. You understand? And those guys, they do not know how to deal with it on that level. So what? They turn to the gun. Rather than talking it out, they want to shoot it out. So this is where the violence interrupters who work in the communities 24/7, this is where they would come in purposefully. Project building blocks is a public health approach in dealing with crime and gun violence. Then we have this is where we identify those who are harsh. How do we do that? A simple thing as some of these young men who I work with so very closely to my heart, some of them can't leave their community. Same birth paper that we're speaking about, a lot of them never had their birth paper. I remember working with a young man from St. Paul Street who never left his community. Because why? He's afraid of the war infractions. I personally took him with me to legal affairs to get his birth paper, and he was so excited to know that now he can move a step further and he doesn't have to worry about staying home or doing anything. This is what we mean when we say change in behavior and having intervention strategies. Also, too, lastly, changing community norms, influencing social norms to discourage the use of violence. This here, I believe that it's a holistic approach where each and every one are very, very fundamental in terms of how we treat with social norms and how we implement social norms to make a change in some of these communities. A perfect example, within some of the communities that project building blocks were working in, we would have had community engagements where persons from the team would have had solar panel installation for the community, financial management classes. I myself, I kept a community, St. Paul Street community engagement and Panday, where I was able to hear the needs of the community and try to set strategies that would help them. One of the needs were health issues. So I partnered with the Ministry of Health Ministry of Agriculture and other stakeholders to come into the community so that the community can partner with them and have their BMI done, prostate done, HIV testing done. Those things where are not really keen to come into the community. Also, some of the young men where they partake in a football competition, but I do it from a psychological perspective where I was able to have them do skills training first and get their cognitive abilities ready before they go onto the field. So team building strategies. And then we invited persons from war infractions to beat them against zealots to come in the quarry game and play football against one another. And we even mix them up. So now you're not just seeing that as an enemy, as we often say, but as a brother who you remember you played football with. And this is the sort of intervention that I'm speaking, even from a social work perspective as well too. This is what is needed, where we could bring persons together, find out what are the root causes and intervene.
Definitely some really good points there, Keon, in terms of intervention. I'll now allow Ms. Mickela Panday to share her views on this as well before we move on.
Thank you, my dear, and panelists. I too have to ask for leave, and it's going so well, but I did indicate to my dear friend Christian that I was trying to navigate 2 meetings at one time, but I really did not want to miss this. But I just wanted to say a couple of things. It's a brilliant panel and people are coming from different aspects and everybody is really putting forward solutions. And I think that has been one of the greatest problems, is that we don't have such a probably consultation with enough stakeholders, and then to have the consultation and then implement it. I want to just clear up something because I think the word poverty makes some people uncomfortable. I by no means meant to provide any sort of exhaustive list. In fact, what I was saying is that I agreed with the Honourable Minister, and I was saying, yes, crime is multifaceted. Of course, it's multifaceted, and it has multiple causes. Poverty, not in its simple form of not being able to afford something, but poverty. What I mean by that is areas that have been neglected, the more vulnerable in society. Not that you can't put an all-inclusive fact. That's not what I meant at all. What I mean is that you cannot speak. Social inequality is a better way of saying it. I speak now about what I describe as the working poor. Many people have lost their jobs, they've lost their homes, they've lost their cars. People who had full-time employment, people who on contract employment no longer have work. We have single-parent families, many of them, and you tend to see in the neglected, poorer areas crime rearing its ugly head. Now, I did not know that we were talking about white-collar crime because that would have been absolute fun. I was more or less following from the information that we were speaking about. But what I wanted to also say, social inequality is the haves and have-nots. That's poverty as well, okay? The have and have-nots, the people who have and the people who don't have. And let me tell you, that gap widens every single day. That gap widens every single day. And again, I say, there is a term that I believe there are people who are now the working poor. You come out of university. You don't know that you're going to get a job. There are no entry-level jobs for you. Your dream of owning a car, getting a home, a mortgage, where are you going to get that? So that is why I was saying about also providing jobs and those sorts of things. Now, I go back to prevention, detection, and rehabilitation. Of course, it's social. And I think my good colleague who came before me, Mr. Cunningham, is doing such a great job. Politicians, lawyers may not be able to go into the communities. And there are good, hardworking people who are there working day in, day out with the youth who are neglected, with the youth who feel ostracized, but they don't get They don't seem to be part of the conversation. And to me, they are probably some of the most important people, as I'm sure Mr. Wilson also will agree with me. When it comes to the politics, listen, everything is politics, okay? Everything is politics. Not dirty politics I'm talking about, not mudslinging politics I'm talking about. I'm talking about these are where the laws are made, okay? So it's politics. We see politics happening in the parliament. Let's not hide it. I'm not going to, I'm in the opposition to oppose, and I do not say that just because of this opposition. It happened when the current government was there as well. You see people opposing legislation. And I talk about legislation, and I go back to the minister. The minister talks about things taking time. But you have to prioritize crime legislation if crime is now an endemic in this country, spiraling out of control. You have to prioritize it. And I'm sorry, you need to put a time limit on it. Otherwise, we will continue on and on and on. And you have good men, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Cunningham, coming and giving their ideas, and they're telling them this is the answer. This is the answer. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. These men are telling you this is what the answer is. So you have to put aside party politics and put country first. Whether that will happen, I don't know. But I want to go back to what the judge was saying. Of course, we have some of the best legislation in this country. We have some of the most advanced legislation, more than even some of the first world countries. You know what the problem is? Enforcement. We could go to that parliament every single day and have one of the most impressive legislative agendas we have ever seen, and there is no enforcement. There's no follow through. And I don't want to take everybody's time because it's not fair, and I have to leave. I want to talk briefly, which I've done on numerous occasions, about the DNA legislation. I was there in the parliament in 2009 when it was passed. I was in the opposition. We voted for it. I voted for it. Okay, DNA legislation, which DNA forensic science, which has been around since the 1980s in development, has been around since we've passed the legislation. Wonderful. Everybody voted for it. But we don't have the structures available. Do we have a DNA lab? Why are we still, yes, I think a crime was solved recently, but we still send things abroad. How are you expected to solve crime, right, or detect crime if you don't have the facilities? We don't have a DNA database. We don't have the labs. We might have brilliant people coming out of the university who have studied forensics, but there is no job. So I come back to say, I'm not here to blame politicians or to blame just moms and dads and schools and things, but it has to be everybody working together. And clearly there are people in this society who is not willing to do that and have continuously, since I was a young girl, not that I'm that old now, but since I was a young girl, who used crime as a political football because it suits them. You talk to people, you talk about bring back the death penalty. The death penalty is the law. It never left. It never went anywhere. It never went anywhere. You sit down, we can talk about that at another time. If you're on death row for more than 5 years on the Pratt and Morgan, it becomes cruel and inhumane punishment. The judicial system isn't working. You talk about not having enough magistrates. I'm not even going as high as the High Court at this point, as the assizes. You're talking about magistrates. I've gone, and I'm a civil lawyer, but of course I do pro bono work for criminal law. You go into the Arima Magistrates Court, for example. Poor magistrate is there, she gets sent somewhere else. A matter then becomes part heard. Another magistrate can't hear that. He can't hear that. So it has to be till she comes back. And this time she's in Sangre Grande and this. So if it's something as we need more magistrates, well, then we need more magistrates. But we have the solution. And I want to humbly disagree with my dear friend, the minister. I don't believe the political will is there. I don't believe it's there. And if it was there, people will put ego aside and party politics aside, and they will turn around and they will say, we're willing to work together. And I'm not blaming any one person. And definitely not this government or even the one before or the one before. 20 years ago, crime started, 2001, it started to really, really escalate. Because in 1998, there were 98 murders. Crime has started to escalate, and people have to be willing to work together and not sit in a room drinking tea and coffee Listen to the people on the ground who knows what's happening. When you want to find out how to deal with the issues in the education system, you need to talk to teachers, right? Talk to the people who know what's happening on the ground. Listen to them. Formulate your policy from that. And let's move together. Because one day, it could be us. It could be our children. It could be our grandchildren, nieces, nephews. We see what's happening. And if you don't want to say social inequalities did not affect, and poverty, the word that people seem to be unhappy with, did not affect people even more, or the less advantaged even more during COVID, we're living under a rock. We're living under a rock. Everybody in Toko secondary could have afforded a computer. But we didn't even open, for example, I'm just saying ideas here, this is not to criticize anybody, the community centers and social distance. There are so many young people, OJTs, who are teachers, who would have been willing to come out and help and assist. Where are the homework centers? Where in the areas where people do not have the beautiful schools and the 5-year schools, and they're not going to that. There's a majority of your population. And yes, there are social issues as well. What happens in the home? What happens in schools? But no one person or government can do it. And if we all decided genuinely to say that we were going to come together and work and implement what we already have. One of my colleagues said there are over 100 reports. So reports, pay people more money, spend this, it takes, and it goes into a cabinet and it picks up dust and nothing happens. And that is why in 2023, we are where we are. In 2022, there were over 600 murders. That's my humble view. And I want to just say thank you so much for having me. I was actually invited to do a little meeting on what's happening. I hope you can do one as well on human trafficking. So I was trying to balance both. So thank you, my dear friends. I really, really appreciate it. I was very humbled to be invited and to be in such esteemed company and people with such great experience. So thank you very much. And I hope that you will invite me again. Thank you. And good night, my friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Panday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, Ms. Panday. We were really grateful. We were really grateful, and I think you energized a bit more the conversation there. So I hope when you get some time, you could probably take a look and see how it ended. You know,
I absolutely will. I absolutely will. Thank you. Right. Thank you.
I saw the minister had her hand up. I saw it came down. I think she put it back up. I'm not too sure if it's my Zoom.
Yeah, but I saw Member Haynes. I saw MP Haynes put her hands up before me, so I can give way. Yeah,
you're giving way.
Okay. And then make
yes.
an
MP.
intervention.
Thank you very much. It's not often we get persons giving way, certainly not in the lower house. So I'll take it when I get it. I wanted to touch on some of what Ms. Panday said, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. Wilson, and a lot of us, right? But the idea of starting in the community and what can be done. I certainly, Rushton and Paray raised it. This paralysis by analysis kind of thing that we end up facing when there are things that can be done, there are things that can be measured. There are ways that we can mobilize what we already have and put it to the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And I've recently, just yesterday, I had caused to issue a release on school violence. Now I'm the shadow for education, which is why you'd find me drawing a lot on that space. But in the 2+ years that I've been in the House of Representatives, we have seen the increase in school violence. We've also seen the increase of how it's being shared online and what that means and what social clout you can and cannot get from that sort of thing. And part of what I've done as a member of the House of Representatives, and I take my representative function very seriously, is say, listen, we have to take the communities of Gasparilla, Tabaquite, the communities that exist within my constituency are different. There are some similarities, but there are some differences in some of the communities Mr. Cunningham would have worked in, and different spaces. And so while we understand that crime is a big picture, a national issue, some of the solutions that we may be looking for could be, I believe, on the community level. And how can we target our interventions and get into the spaces? I mean, Tabaquite is different from Mayaro, it's different from St. Augustine. We have similarities, but we certainly have things that we can do within our communities. So I've an initiative. We are starting an anti-bullying campaign for schools within our region. We have to make it a national campaign that's coming on board, because I think bullying is a start for the school violence that we are facing. So that is coming on board from my office as a member of parliament for Tabaquite. We are also looking at advocating very vociferously for things like conflict resolution, anger management to be part of the curriculum, so that you aren't going to wait till you're in the prisons, Mr. Wilson, to treat with some of these things. So that if we have them in school too, you know, I mean, at the very least, there's a certain level of compulsory education. And if we can get some of these life skills that are so clearly missing, if we can bring that in as part of our curriculum, if we can show students, listen, there are ways to resolve conflict without violence. As we get to that space, I think we'll be a lot better. So we are looking, we're also looking at our public spaces, our recreation grounds, etc., and using those as well as a space for utilizing energy that may be otherwise misplaced. We are looking at groups that have already existed within the Tabaquite constituency: football, cricket, dance, etc., and really harnessing what we have in our community, and to give people a space that they can become involved and not feel ostracized, not feel like they don't have a space, not feel that there isn't something working for them. And I think if we can look at that across the board, we would really get into we'll get into a space that we need to get into. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. And, you know, we do have some current youth groups working on having conflict resolution sessions for their young persons that they could reach out to. So we need to see how best we could push that a little bit more. And I just want to say a big thank you to the Nariva Mayaro District Youth Council for allowing us to have this conversation here this evening. I'm pretty sure Chris can agree with me by saying we see some key points coming up here. Some familiar, some not so familiar. I see one of the reoccurring pointers for me that I would love, I really wish we had more time, we could dive in a little bit more to, is unity or the lack thereof in certain situations when it comes to addressing crime. But Chris, what are your thoughts on this so far?
Oh, you put me on the spot.
Yes.
What are my thoughts on this so far?
Yeah.
What are my thoughts on this so far? It's interesting. It's interesting because I think they are direct questions, and while we are getting some of the answers, there are some we're not really getting. I think we're just touching the surface. I don't know if it is because of a time constraint as well. That may be the issue here. Where it pertains to crime, I do agree that it is something that should really take each one of us. We all play a role from the schools to the churches, as the minister would have indicated. So I also think that whilst there's a legislative side, which we get in there with, hopefully, as I think the judge would have mentioned, that we are a young democracy, if that is, I don't want to misquote her, but we also have a lot to do where it pertains to empowering communities, yeah? We have a lot to do where it pertains to empowering communities. We have a lot to do with educational reform. What we push as what is the societal norm and what is the bar? What is really the bar? Is it, being a doctor and a lawyer and an engineer? I mean, while I am studying within, I guess, the stereotypical bar, I am still, as Ms. Panday said, I can in a few months come out with my degree, and there's nothing really there for me right now. But But it's not about what I think. Samantha, it's what about somebody's panelists think. So I saw the minister. You would have had up your hand, and then I want to take MP after Keon, and then we'll take a look at video 3. Before we take the minister, is it okay if we go over a few minutes? Is that okay? If we go over a few minutes, because I'm looking at 10 minutes, 8:26, and we were scheduled to finish by 8:30.
I am so enjoying it. Yes, you could take an hour if you may. I think I have everything.
No.
Unfortunately, I don't have an hour.
No, well, how we can make a hard stop at 9 o'clock. Is 9 o'clock okay?
That's okay.
I'm fine with that.
No problem. Sure.
Fine. And that sounds good.
All right. Well, Minister, you gave way.
Yeah, I did give way, right? But again, I want to springboard and Member Haynes, and I keep referring to Member Haynes as if I'm in a joint select committee. I do apologize. MP Haynes made a point just now, and she spoke about what she has been doing in her constituency.
You can also call me Anita. That is my first name, and that is what I go by. So please feel free. Make it very easy.
Okay. What and why I'm springboarding off of that point is because Anita spoke about what she has been doing at a constituency level. And you know what that opens up? That opens up the conversation of social responsibility of every single citizen to play their critical role and part in this crime fighting exercise. So, for example, Ms. Haynes would have spoken about initiatives with cyberbullying at that community level. And I think once the young people like yourself continue that conversation, that it is really about, during the, for example, if I go back to the theme of today's discussion, right? Crime, a public health emergency. Let's go back, for example, to what we would have had to do as a nation in putting a handle on dealing with COVID-19. There is not one person that is currently sitting on this table, at this round table, or any person who's looking on that cannot say, there's not one person that can say, I should say, that I have not been impacted or affected in one way or the other by COVID-19. There's not a soul, I am sure, and I can put my head on a block for that there's not one person that can say that the regulations, the law did not impact my life in one way or the other. But do you know the result of that was each and every one of us, and that is why I say each and every one of us, whether it was by simply obeying with the curfew, whether it was by socially distancing, whether it was by not having a Zesa party when you was not supposed to have one, regardless of what it was, we each played a critical role in putting a handle on COVID-19. Yes, we know there are the naysayers. Yes, we know there were the criticisms even for the government relative to policies and things that were implemented in order to deal with COVID-19. Yes, we know that there was that narrative. But let's be real. As a nation, whether we're government, whether we're opposition, whether we're just mere citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, we can all be proud as a nation that we each played a critical role in manhandling COVID-19, because there were nations greater, bigger, richer than us that fell by the wayside because of the pandemic. And we can all still sit or stand today as proud citizens. And we can certainly tap ourselves on our shoulder. Why? Because we each took social responsibility. During the pandemic, there were all these hashtags, and I know young people like hashtag we in this together, hashtag no one left behind. You know why those hashtags were critical? Because it reminded citizens of the role you play. And that's why I springboarded out of what Ms. Haynes would have spoken about, the role and the responsibility she has taken on in her constituency. She's an opposition member, but recognizing that I have people that I represent and I do my part in my space and my place to make it better. And I think once every single citizen, especially you all as a young people, recognize that you have a critical role to play in this crime fighting exercise, then of course Trinidad and Tobago will be a better space. Now, from the Office of the Attorney General perspective, for example, we also reckon, let's be real, our responsibility, our role is really, if we look in the grand scheme of whole of government, our role is really with respect to the creation of legislation, the passage of legislation. But even internalizing and while introspecting, once we recognize that there's a piece of legislation that is on the books, but we are unable to operationalize it, what we have taken an approach is, for want of a better word, we are stepping outside of the box and we are thinking outside of the box. So for example, I know member Panday, Ms. Panday would have spoken about, let's say, for example, the forensic legislation. All right. Yes, certainly the legislation in June 2018, for example, we had the regulations that was implemented in order to support that legislation. But what we have had to do at the Office of the Attorney General, for example, and I'm pleased to say, coming back to thinking out of the box and recognizing our responsibility, not just in the creation of the law, but now in the operationalization of the law, we decided to establish the Justice Sector Stakeholder Advisory Committee on Forensic and Medical Legal Evidence. Now, why I'm making reference to this particular committee is that committee is now spearheaded by the head of our Criminal Justice Unit. The committee, of course, key critical stakeholders sit on that committee. And you know what is the responsibility of that committee? That committee is to lend to the forensic science, to breathe life. That committee is charged with the responsibility of breathing life into the legislation and lending the support to all of the key stakeholders, the critical agents in making sure that life is bred into this legislation. This committee coming out of the Office of the Attorney General was created to give that additional support. For example, when we look at the sex offender registry coming out of the Office of the Attorney General, again, a task force was created. And that task force, again, was birthed from our Criminal Justice Unit, again, spearheaded by the head of our Criminal Justice Unit, and working with the TTPS, working with the Judiciary, working with the DPP's office in order to help, to assist these critical, again, players to be able to populate, to be able to operationalize the sex offender registry. The simple point that I'm making, again, recognizing that we all are not lawyers, and of course, there are a lot of young people viewing. Sometimes there is a need for us to think outside of the box and operate outside of the box. If we really, and that is why it comes back to, I will stand without, and yes, I will be contradicted, but I will continue to stand firm in my belief that there is the political will on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago to get this thing done. But, and that is because, and I can speak from our ministry's perspective, we have, and those are just two examples of the many examples of task force and certain little subcommittees we have created to work with stakeholders beyond the legislation. We could say as a ministry, once that legislation goes on the book, that's the end of our work. We finish. You understand? But then how does that redound to the benefit of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago? Recognizing it does not redound to the benefit of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. That is the approach that we have already started. It started during the time of the previous Attorney General, who I would say that I had the privilege of learning and working with, and it continues under the current Attorney General, and certainly as Minister in the Office of the Attorney General, it's something that I always advocate for. What is the point of a legislation on the book if we cannot breathe life into that legislation? And just by those simple two basic examples, when we look at the sex offender task force that was created, when we look at the Justice Sector Stakeholder Advisory Committee that we would have created, that was created in the Office of the Attorney General, those are but two of the many examples of the way in which we have recognized our part, and even stepping outside of our remit, for want of a better word, stepping outside of what our real responsibilities, which is the creation of the law, to all continue to give assistance to key stakeholders beyond the creation of the legislation and beyond the legislation being on the books. So, you know, just to sum up briefly, because I know I see several members with their hands up. Again, springboarding out of what Ms. Haynes said, just as she would have done in her constituency, just as I am sure MP Paray would have done in his constituency, continues to do in his constituency. Each and every one of us have a critical role to play. We cannot just throw our hands up and say, woe is me, and I'm not in government, or I'm in opposition, I'm just a young person, or I don't have resources. We each have a critical role to play. We have to take responsibility. Hashtag, we are all in this together. Thank you for the opportunity to make that brief intervention.
Thank you so much. So we'll go directly to MP Paray to hear his contribution.
Thank you again. And, I just wanted to identify, some basic items, right? I mean, our young people today are asking for simple things. They want a job. They want to be able to get a sustainable job that could allow them to buy a home. And when they could buy a home, they'll be able to have a family. And those are three critical things that in the mind of our young professional class, in the mind of our young people who are graduating from secondary school, graduating from university. And the state has a role to play here in terms of creating an environment for job creation, because we talk about crime, we talk about linking the unavailability of jobs and so on, especially at the lowest end of the ladder. I do not believe it is the function of the state to find a work for everybody. I do not agree to that at all. There will be jobs that the state will provide, but it is the function of the state to create an environment where business can flourish. So coming out of the pandemic, where we had an approximate, based on the Confederation of Business Chambers, they estimated over 6,000 SMEs collapsed. Now you're looking at 6,000 by at least about 4 persons working in each one of those businesses. You're looking at about 24,000, 25,000 people would have been out of jobs. And these are people at the lowest rung of the ladder. The thing here is that the state must have systems in place to find those SMEs. What went wrong? How do you get them into the formal system? Because the problem with the grants and so on that were given to help these SMEs, a lot of them were not registered in terms of their Board of Inland Revenue status and so on. But prior to the pandemic, I mean, still nothing has been done. When you look at the fact that we have crime that is affecting communities where small businesses are closing, a lot of community activities, when time to sponsor sports clubs, all force clubs and so on, they go to these small businesses within the community. And if we don't have a targeted approach in dealing with crime, and more of these small businesses collapse at the end of the day, communities are going to struggle in terms of the same activity that Anita spoke about, trying to get their energies somewhere else. These small businesses can't even help at the end of the day. And if you jump from small business to the fact where we're looking at foreign direct investment to bring in the big money, the big projects, to put our professionals to work, when you have this environment of crime, when you have the issues with the judiciary, when you have issues with things like the intellectual property laws and so on, that when these foreign companies have to look at an investment climate, they're not too happy with what's going on in Trinidad from a lot of areas. When you look at the issues, I know that Mickela touched briefly on this issue of human trafficking, which is to me a stain on this country. And these things we must address urgently. And while I know we spoke about legislation have to be taken time and we need to do it right, and I agree, because we don't write legislation for today. We write legislation that is going to take us 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And we don't want to put legislation where the state ends up in a problem legally, and then it costs the state to defend themselves with bad law and so on. But there are simple little things that we can do to address some matters. And I have a couple ideas, just want to throw it very quickly. We'll talk about the issue, Madam Judge spoke about this issue of domestic violence, and we had so much of powerful legislation. We can use local government by simple decision at the council level, right, to put programs in place in every constituency or every municipality to put a fair amount of work for those guys who are coming out of the prison system, that we could put them to work within the local government system, that they can be financially independent and not having to worry where the dollar is coming from to go back into a life of crime. That's a simple thing that could be done at a council level. putting single mothers and women to work. We can sit at council level and say, look, 40% of labor can go to single mothers and single women in empowering them financially so they go to work. And when they go back into the home, the children in the home now have a working mother and she becomes more empowered to control them, to discipline them. And don't talk about the wayward husbands who feel that because the wife not working, you could come and talk to she how you want to, and if she too lash and run she. Now you have women who are empowered, say, hey, mister, don't touch me because I'm working for my own money. Now, these are simple little things that doesn't require legislation that's coming out of the Attorney General office. And I just use those two. But local government is a very powerful institution that we can use very, very smartly to deal with a lot of issues that we spoke about in terms of, creating opportunities for women and empowering them. Simple in the schooling system. We have, I think Keon spoke about, we need to let our young people know that, pulling a gun and a knife is not what you want to do. Why have we stopped debating clubs in schools? I remember 20 years ago, a debating club was something standard from primary school to secondary school. When you have debating clubs and debating societies in school, we are telling our young people that, listen, it is okay to have a difference of opinion without I pulling a gun and a knife. And that's a cultural thing that we have to emphasize. I've asked my schools here in Mayaro, and I told them that I will fund it. I will find sponsor fund. Let's introduce back ballroom dancing back in the schools. So that's what we're going to do with ballroom dancing. I said, I want to put an 11-year-old boy and an 11-year-old girl together, close together, to learn to dance as a discipline. But they come close to one another without the sexuality part in it. We have a sexual issue in this country. We have a culture that is highly sexual. It's highly driven, our music, our carnival. And then we worry why we have 15,000 cases in the court for sexual violence in this country, right? I am saying if we can train our young people, especially at that 11, 12, and 13-year-old, to stand close to one another, learn to dance, and they become comfortable with one another, you would find the respect for the young ladies that the young men can grow up with, and they go outside there into the world as teenagers, respecting our young women. So, I mean, there are probably people much smarter than me who could come up with a lot of these things. But there are simple things like these that we can push back in our schools, in our communities, that can start to address some of these issues. Even our school curriculum as well. We don't have a culture of activism in this country. We confuse activism with terrorism. Dragging a log across the road and burning 4 tires, that is not activism. That is terrorism. If in our school system, when we are teaching, our history, or physics and chemistry and so on, we get our young people passionate about, something, issues, you find they will become more aware. They become more aware. They hold out their leaders more accountable at the end of the day as well. So, I mean, there is no easy fix. There are some simple things that we can start at the level of your communities. But again, you need the participation. You need people who are willing to stand and have that conversation. And, getting that is the hardest part. My challenge here in Mayaro, I can tell you, we bring the experts in to talk about domestic violence, to talk about incest, any of these social issues. But, it's the wrong audience come. The people who are most affected, because we treat some of these issues as taboo in this country, the audience that you want to come, they don't come. And that is a big challenge. So we have to find a way of how we can get the right audience, us with the experts, to talk, encourage them to have these open conversations. And I do believe the fixes are not difficult. It needs, as Anita and even Mickela said, everybody has to be on board. All of government approach, as Senator Sagramsingh said, and we could do it, and we can get it in a way that we could start seeing over time a reduction. But we must create an environment for business to flourish. If we can't get back business to flourish in this country, we can't put people to work. And I think that is very, very critical. We have to find a way to put people back to work from now going forward. And it means government policy. It means having a certain attitude in terms of how we encourage private sector to pull this $10, $12 billion that is sitting in commercial banks doing nothing. We need to get that money out invested and they do business and they create jobs for people, and we can start seeing the reduction in some of the petty crimes that you see happening. So I just wanted to throw that 2 cents in. Thank you.
I appreciate your contribution and your ideas on how we can get small businesses involved in this fight as well, if we may say. I also would like to take this time to recognize the chairman of the Nariva Mayaro District Youth Council, who's been with us the entire evening, Mr. Patrick Phillips. And once again, remind our audience, if you have any questions or any comments, to submit them before we head into rapid fire. So at this time, I recognize Commander Dindial.
Good evening again. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. So delving directly into it, let us not fool ourselves. Trinidad and Tobago, when we start talking about crime in Trinidad and Tobago, we really looking at violent crimes. We're not looking at white collar crime. So Mickela alluded to that, and we could have a whole other conversation about white collar crime. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we're really looking at violent crime and murders. And it's a very small part of the community that it affects. And it's a very small grouping. So we come back to what we're looking at, gangs. And it is really perpetrated by gangs. And I'm just dealing with violent crime. I'm not dealing with the domestic issues. I'm just dealing with violent crime and murders. It is really perpetrated by the gangs and the gang members. Now, it is quite laudable that member Sagramsingh and her department have all the legislation there, and they are actually helping the stakeholders to operationalize the legislation. However, as Mickela and Madam Justice Haynes said, it is the operationalizing of these things. So that comes back down squarely on the shoulders of the only institution in Trinidad and Tobago that has to do that, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. So we must look at the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service when it comes to operationalizing it. Now you ask yourself a question, why it is that crime was reduced during our former commissioner's time. And I don't want to say, everybody talks about Gigi. Everybody talks about Gigi and the things that he had in place. Now, it comes down to leadership. You have to have leadership and you have to have operationalization of the resources that you have. So some of the things that that commissioner did, and I don't want to say that because there's things up in the air for our new commissioner to continue, but the strategic organization and restructuring of the Trinidad Police Service for a greater efficiency. That was one of the key things. He also had things in the units making the officers use body cameras. He had things there, the white collar crime unit, the special investigations unit, reinstituting the cold case missing persons unit, the riverine police unit, the SORT unit. So there were certain things. There's also the Trinidad and Tobago Police app, and we're talking about data and technology, where he instituted that, where people can now give information to the police service anonymously. So he was using data and using technology in order to help crime, in order to fight crime. And crime, as I said, violent crime, we're talking about a violent crime. So we have to recognize that the operationalizing of our institution is important. Yes, Madam Justice said we have the best laws. We do. We have some laws that are even better than the UK, but we're not good at operationalizing it. And we are failing at that. We are failing at that in institution. And where? Proper leadership, proper management, leadership and management. And leadership and management goes throughout every single institution in Trinidad and Tobago. And it goes back down to even some of the things that our financial institution. We heard MP Paray says accountability. Very, very important word. We tend to hold our leaders accountable, but when we, the youth, look out and see that the so-called accountability, nothing happens. They get away with everything. So you come back and say to yourself, the youth, well, the big people doing it, nothing is happening. We're talking about this word accountability, but who is holding them accountable? We have to have a proper leader in place to hold his institution accountable. to have management of performance and measure those performances. And if you can't come up to the bar, you know what? Here's what. You are going to be fired. We're going to get somebody who's going to do the job. And as MP Haynes was saying, our job is for the people, you know. Our job is to make sure that she brings things for the people. And that is all of our jobs. Once you get into a position of power, especially in organizations like that, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, or any one of those institutions that operationalizes crime to make sure detection, you have to do your duty and do your job properly and purposefully without, as my good friend Mr. Wilson was saying, political fever. So we have seen it done. It is there. We can do it. We can do it. We have to get together and we can do it. And the conversation can go on and on, as I said, for the other white collar crimes, but I'm just sticking to this sort of crime that we're looking at, murders and stuff. But we can fix it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, MP Haynes.
Yes, thank you. And I'll just come in really quickly. I'm glad I came after you, Lieutenant Commander, because I mean, what you touched on is exactly what I was going to say in terms of when we see that things are working, where we have things that are working, and the evidence shows us that they're working by a reduction in violent crime, etc. Wouldn't it be the logical thing to keep the things that are working and improve upon it, so I've, you know, and talking about the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and going back to what Justice Haynes said at the very beginning, which is that her job is to convict those who are guilty and acquit those who cannot be proven to be guilty, which gets us exactly where Lieutenant Commander Dindia was just at, which is that if you do not have a well-resourced, well-led TTPS that can bring together the evidence supported by DPP's office that can bring the case that you need to get convictions, then nothing else that we're talking about will come to fruition. And I mean, I've said this in several motions in Parliament. We could pass 1 million laws. Criminals are not put off by laws. I've never heard of one criminal say, I can't do that, it's against the law. That's just not the way it works, right? So the laws are there to allow for a conviction if you break the law, but that can only be done if you make steps 1, 2, and 3. And so, yes, we've spoken a lot about prevention. We've spoken a lot about community engagement, but let us never forget that there is a critical role for the state, to ensure that there is a well-resourced TTPS, that the policy on national security is one that is holistic, that seeks to improve our justice system, to get convictions so that you can get a sense of justice in Trinidad and Tobago. And until we get back to what my very first point was, consequences for actions, people will continue to do what they want.
Thank you, MP Haynes. I see Mr. Cunningham, you have your hand up. I just want to say we have a few more minutes until we close, and we still want to get enough 1 or 2 questions and then allow everyone to possibly have closing remarks quickly.
Yes, I just want to very, very thoughtful points from all my colleagues there. I see that we are being much more proactive than reactive, which is a good step, especially at this micro level. Whilst on micro, I know that what the conversation that we were just having was basically much more at the macro level as we deal with policies, legislation, legislature, and those kind of things. What I want to say firstly is that my humble opinion, I believe that social work is the foundation for any society, and it's such a flexible profession that it allows itself to fit in the macro level as well as the micro level. So we could get that sort of correlation from the micro and the macro. MP Haynes would have said something about communities that are different from one another, which is very, very true. And this is why I always advocate for understanding your community when you want to know what you have to implement. This is why you do a needs assessment, in my humble opinion. Sometimes, and this is on a general consensus, we tend to implement things in communities that the communities don't need. A perfect example would be sometimes we want to build a community center in a community, thinking that the persons may utilize the community center when that's not what they need. We never did any sort of needs assessment, no sort of intervention from that ground point to understand what is needed in the community. Where does that take us? We end up in a position or a situation where now we have to rethink what we want to do. So the communities and the people in those communities, they tend to be moving in such a way that they don't care. Because why? You will never listen to us. Sometimes that is one of the major issues in terms of dealing with criminality from that micro level that we face in our society. Also, in terms of the conflict resolution classes, I know there are services in the different departments. For example, Ministry of Sport and Community Development, they have their community mediation services department, I believe, which goes out in the community. And this is why we need to focus on that all governance approach. Even when I sit as a board member for the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, these are something that I emphasize on. Having that all governance approach where we have collective thinking to work together for the best interests for our nation's children. Also, again, one other intervention that we would have implemented when the project building blocks was alive and well before it was terminated in December 20 of last year. We would have did a Take One initiative where we work with stakeholders and tell them, here is the scene. Just take one young man, try to change their life. Take one, let them do a work, let them do a job. And this is what MP Paray is saying, where we need to work together and understand what we are dealing with. If every business could employ one young man, take one, see how they're doing, analyze them, teach them the ropes and let them do something purposefully, I believe from that.
I think Mr. Cunningham is having some technical difficulties.
Hi, Keon, can you hear us? Mr. Cunningham, can you hear us? I think we're having some difficulties on that end, but what I will do though, as we head into the closing remarks, I would like to just go around the table and ask everyone for a few suggestions as we move forward from your perspective, and then I will allow you to give us any tips or anything that you'd like to add into the conversation as we close this evening. All right, so who would like to go first? Mr. Wilson, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Let me say I'm a bit disappointed. I think that we walked around the trenches, but we didn't go into the trenches at all. We spent a lot of time looking at legislation and what have you, but I have dedicated my life to crime and criminality and what we can do to solve these issues. And I don't think we have even scratched the surface in terms of what do we do. So we spoke a lot, and let me say, MP Haynes, that I appreciate the response, and of course I take a suggestion. But what I meant really is that look how nice we can come together, you know, from various backgrounds, opposition, and of course the MP, and have a discussion without putting politics in there. Although politics is in everything, yes. But I'm saying it's nice for us to get together. But I'm disappointed in the sense that I sat and I heard a lot, but I have not, and let me say something, Mr. Cunningham. Persons like you and I will have a lot of problems trying to get our position across because to me, the softer skills are never recognized. you are in the trenches doing so much, but then who cares, right? And I work for an NGO, Vision and Mission. We, deportees come in here, we take them, we do what we have to do, ex-inmates, and we try to change them, rehabilitate them, get jobs for them and what have you. But then at the same time, who cares? This is how we feel sometimes, because if you don't get down to the communities and start working, like the point I made about data, a simple thing like looking at what has happened to those persons for the last 10 years, let's follow them and see what is happening to them. What are happening? We have so many single, look, for instance, somebody told me today, they said that they spoke to a young boy in school. What do you want to be? He said he wanted to be a particular community leader, like him. He said, when I wanted sneakers, he said he bought it for me. So you know what has happened there, Mr. Cunningham and Ms. Haynes and others? Right away, he sees that community leader as his champion. So I'm saying we have to have this discussion, yes, but let's get down in the trenches a little more and stop, having these airy-fairy suggestions and things that are not happening. So that's my point. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And taking from that, I have to agree with you. I feel like this was too short. Even though we spent a few hours with each other, we really didn't get to where we want to go. And I know Chris is sitting there just like me, and I'm like, listen, I went through these questions and I want to ask this, I want to know more. So I think it's safe to say that we need a part 2. What do you think, Chris? Yeah?
Yeah, no, 100%. We need a part 2. Definitely need a part 2, because we didn't even get into the rehabilitation side, and that would have been a big side. So definitely a part 2.
Yeah, so a part 2 is in the making. We promise not to disappoint this time, and so we learn from every experience. All right, so I would now ask. I'm just going around the screen here like eeny, meeny, miny, mo. So I saw Mr. Cunningham's mic is on. He's back with us, so you can go ahead.
Yeah. I just listened what the former Commissioner of Prisons said, and you're so very right. The sort of recognition that is needed for us, we don't necessarily get it. I often call ourselves the superheroes without capes, because where we are willing to go and what we are willing to do is so important, especially meeting with some of these young men, hearing how their survival instincts are. You understand? And again, this is why I'm advocating for social to be much more at the forefront, because it's much needed in our society, a society as Trinidad and Tobago. You understand? I think this is a step for the greater good, as much as we may not probably got into what we wanted to get in, but I'm still thankful because we can still learn something from the policymakers, the legislation aspect of it, and see how best we could find solutions. Though it may not be the conversation or how we directly conversation per se, but I'm still grateful and thankful to be here. And one thing I want to share with each and everyone is that wherever you go in this life, all you have is your voice, and your voice is a very, very powerful thing. You could have what degree, MSc, BSc, PhD. When you come together in a room, all you do have is your voice. And your voice could do many, many things. It can educate, inspire, motivate, and uplift. And I'm so very thankful to be in this realm again with such experience and knowledgeable people to learn more so than to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cunningham. Lieutenant Commander, would you like to give us your remarks?
Sure, thank you. Pointing back to the flyer and the forum where our Prime Minister has declared crime as a public health emergency, and what we were supposed to talk about, and recognizing that, that we may have another session in order to deal with that. In my view, crime is a public health issue. I can't see it as an emergency just yet. Public health issue. So in my closing remarks, I need to say this. We have already known that crime in society has to be dealt with over and ambit of things. Socioeconomic, cultural aspects. We knew this even from day one. So everybody who doing their thesis in criminology will tell you that. So all we are doing right now is just taking in excess and giving it a nomenclature. We are saying it now, we're saying it's public health. But it has always been that. So we know it. All we are doing is saying it differently. However, and we would delve into that at the next session, we have to be careful, because when things are under public health and public health emergency legislation, it allows us to sometimes give up our democracy. And the lawyers will take into that, and I will leave it there, because we have to be careful, because during the COVID pandemic, we had a public health emergency, but it was a policing state under health, because you couldn't go anywhere. Curfews, restrictions, things that you didn't need a special majority for. Public health emergency. So we need to be careful when we're defining something as a public health emergency. I will say it is a public health issue where we now could be able to focus on some of the things, the ancillary things around crime. And the rehabilitation with Mr. Wilson, I agree with you. Rehabilitation is one of the big things that I see that we need to focus on. We need and reintegration of people into our society. But having it as a public emergency, we need to be careful and keep that in the back of our minds for our next discussion, that we don't give up our freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. MP Paray.
Thank you very much. I want to say very, very quickly to Mr. Wilson that I do share your concern in terms of that you felt that perhaps we ran around the mulberry bush for quite some time without getting into some core issues. I don't think 2.5 hours would have been anyway adequate with 6 or 8 of us, to really dive into any particular piece of the meat of the matter. But I think the positive out of this message today is that we would have had a couple hundred young people who would have looked at it live and those who will review it eventually. And I think the functions that were done today by all of us would be to plant a few seeds in the minds of our young people. And by planting those seeds, we have engaged them in their own creative process as well. And perhaps on the next occasion, they may participate more. But I think we've done our jobs here this evening in terms of talking about a number of areas. The second thing before, in closing, I do feel that, I want to agree with Lieutenant Commander Dindial that we must be very careful when we label crime as a public health issue. And I would also exercise caution on that, not only for, Commander's view in terms of the ability to rule by regulation under the public health legislation, but I still feel strongly that the issue of crime is buried in a social reform system and a complete review of our judicial system, from the policing to the judiciary in terms of the prosecution part, and to the prison system in terms of how do we rehabilitate. And when these guys come out, how do we use our local government, which I absolutely believe is the fix for every single problem in this country, can be fixed from the local government. And I think if we can, get to that point and be able to really use those systems to help, I think we will get somewhere. And lastly, we are all handicapped in every job that we do. Commander Dindial in the Coast Guard, Mr. Wilson, while you were in prisons as the head, I am sure your hands would have been tied as well in so many things. And for MP Haynes and myself, and I'm sure Senator Sagramsingh, she sits in government, she sits in cabinet, but I'm sure her hands are tied in a lot of areas as well, things that she may want to do, but she can't. And the problem is, and as I close, that we are a 19th century parliamentary system trying to service a 21st century audience, but we are constrained by a Cold War relic called the Civil Service Act. And, you know, I sit at joint select committees sometimes and I would hear our public officers say, well, we couldn't do this because of section 125912. And I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that. Because we are so constrained in this old antiquated system. And you know, people have been penalized over the years for coming out of that everybody takes a pushback approach that are not crossing the line. And we're heading into the 21st century now, where we need to be aggressive. We need to be very quickly. We competing with global operations today. And if we don't find a method legislatively in our constitution to try and rip this old Cold War relic out and find a way forward, you will change governments every 5 years and we will be nowhere closer to a fix. And with those few words, I want to thank the organization for inviting me to share some views. I want to thank my colleagues for participating. I am indeed in a better place for listening. You know, Mr. Wilson, Commander Dindial, you know, Senator Sagramsingh, Ms. Panday, Keon, everybody was here today. It has added value to my thinking, and I am sure as we go forward in the parliament and as we go forward as legislators and as representatives in our communities, you know, these ideas will continue to flourish, and we will do what we can as representatives of the people as well. So thank you and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, MP. Now we'll have Minister Sooklal.
Thank you very much. You know, certainly going back to the topic, you know, crime, criminal, public health emergency. I want to, unfortunately, I'll have to disagree with Mr. Wilson. I am not disappointed by the way in which this conversation would have gone. And I would say this, and I would explain why. This is we have all recognized that this is a very big topic. And I know Samantha would have asked a question for our advice. You know, she did mention if we want to give some advice in moving forward. Before I get into my brief closing remarks, what this has done and what this should make the young people of this country recognize is where I would have started when I did my opening remarks, which is saying that crime is multifaceted. And perhaps what you, the committee, and also the young people who are interested in engaging in these and similar and like conversations would want to consider is then streamlining your conversation. So for example, let's say we are looking at crime and social services in Trinidad and Tobago, crime and the education system, crime and the Ministry of Youth Development, crime and the law, crime and TTPS, because it's multifaceted. And in that way, what you may be able to find, it'll be your expectations will be met, because then it's going to be a specific conversation with a specific targeted group. And that's just the mommy in me, that's just the teacher in me, giving a little advice to, of course, the young people. And perhaps what you may want to consider as you continue, and I continue to applaud you, and I say to you, continue this conversation. And this is no mama guy. This is no mama guy at all. You all have to be applauded. Your MP for encouraging you have to be applauded. And let me tell you why. Because too many times, young people, as we know it, you use platforms like this for banter and bacchanal. And you know what you all have done today? You all have used a social media platform to encourage conversation. You have brought to my mind a very strong panel. Today was my niece's first birthday party, and I left that to come in. And to me, that was important because it's a private commitment I had, but I recognize how important this was. And I'm sure just like all of the other persons who gave up their time to come here, recognizing how important this is to you all and how important this conversation is. We all gave up what we had to do to contribute. So I am not disappointed at all. What you all have started is the conversation. And I would repeat that you're an example to the young people of this country to realize that you can use your platform, not for banter, not just for bacchanal, but you can use it for something positive. And I have to applaud you. Now, again, the Prime Minister did on the 18th of July 2022 at a press conference refer to crime as a crime, a public health emergency. And I believe it was at that, and not I believe, at that said conference, the Prime Minister would have said that the approach of the government in moving forward, of course, was to create, again, for want of a better word, a task force that is now a whole of government, a task force that is going to be charged with the responsibility in treating with the issue of crime. The Prime Minister at that conference, I recall distinctly speaking about this Ministry of Social Development, the Ministry of Health. His office, he also alluded to, would be directly involved in treating with crime, TTPS, THA, national security, sports, education, you name it. The Prime Minister in that conference would have certainly spoken about, would have alluded to what his intention was in creating, for want of a better word, a task force for us to tackle crime from a whole of government perspective. But what I can say, though, and this is also to encourage you all to do some more reading, I have to agree with the Prime Minister in making reference to crime as a public health emergency, because even if we look at regional and international comparators, there are many countries. For example, let's say if we look regionally, let's look at Jamaica. I recall not too long ago, I think it was about the 27th of November 2022, Radio Jamaica, there was a Dr. Simaj who actually, looking at crime in Jamaica, described the problem as a public health epidemic and said, and I recall from that article reading, said that crime has to be treated like a disease. Also, I recall, okay, let's say even if we look at what's happening in the UK in 2019, for example, there was a publication done by Jennifer Brown on, of course, police and she's a police and crime specialist for the House of Commons, and she shared a similar view, recognizing that a public health approach has to be taken when looking at serious crime. So I just wanted to start from that point of recognizing that when the Prime Minister would have made such a statement, I am in agreement, simply because of course, as throughout the length and breadth of this conversation, we recognize that each party, each person, there are different ministries. This transcends ministries, this transcends race, this transcends religion when we are dealing with the issue of crime. Now, so that being said, in closing, what does this mean to us? It is just to simply reiterate that as a government, we recognize that in treating with crime, it is a whole of government approach. All hands have to be on deck. I'm dealing with young people under this government. And again, this is not being political, but let's speak to what is in existence. Let's speak to the policy that is in existence. We have created a ministry, a Ministry of Youth Development and National Service. And it's so much. And that's why I said I'm not disappointed in the direction that the conversation went, because it's just a lot to capture in 2 hours. But let me just take, for example, the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service. And this is just simply scratching the surface. We have, for example, the 40 Under 40 program. We have the Youth Agricultural Homestead program. We have the Paliseco Agricultural Project. The Youth Ministry leads restorative program for young women. We have the construction of the El Dorado Youth Development Apprenticeship program. There are so many programs. There's an entire ministry that is allocated towards developing our young people. Then, of course, if we turn to education, I know MP Haynes would have spoken about crime and violence in schools. If we look at the education, for example, there's a national school, the school at high risk of violence identification criteria matrix coming out of the Ministry of Education during the tenure of this administration. A matrix, of course, is created, and there is literature out there, a lot, too much to be able to explain in the few minutes that I have to close up, that speaks to the issue of violence, even at a school level. If we turn to the Ministry of Sports, for example, I recall commending, highly applauding my colleague, Minister Shamfor Kojo, when she created the Empower program. And that is a program that focused on deprived youth males from communities, depressed communities, and of course, providing mentorship for young men. What is important, and I can go through the length and breadth, it's whole of government, it's too much to speak about, as I said before, in 2 hours. But there are programs that are in place. What is now important, I know personally that an attempt has been made by every single ministry, of course, is to have the information out there so that our young people are aware of what is available to them. This is a platform, again, of young people. And I want to use the opportunity to also, again, springboarding out of that critical contribution made by MP Haynes when she spoke about, again, what she is doing in her space and her place in her constituency. That again speaks to taking social responsibility. I want to remind the young people that this government remains committed, albeit yes, the narrative may be otherwise. There will be persons with separate views. There is the political will to be able to take the attraction out of crime. I don't even want to get into the law, because if I have to get into the law and deal with white collar crime, it means I have to look at laws that were passed under this administration. For example, the Civil Asset Recovery and Management and the Unexplained Wealth Act, which sought to take money out of crime and let people explain. If you have a set of money and you're not employed, or you explain to me, in other words, very simply put, how you're making that money. If we look at public procurement and the disposal of property, that's on the legislative end, how we have tried as a government to tackle white collar crime. If, for example, you look at the Securities Act, there was an amendment that was brought not too long ago, the Finance Number 2 Act of 2021, where we sought to deal with the issue of Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes, again, trying to tackle white collar crime. So again, it's a lot to speak about in the hour and the time that we have, but I want to reiterate and speak from a government perspective, because of course I'm the only person in government currently sitting on this panel. As we speak about crime, we have recognized as a government that it requires all hands on deck. And I will go back to those hashtags. We are all in this together. Hashtag be your brother's keeper. And that is why I talk about Jared Nurse when you all started this with the lyrics of his song. I love that song, to be very honest. And if we truly listen to the lyrics of that song, it speaks to the importance of really being our brother's keeper. It speaks to the importance of everyone. Sometimes really, yes, politics is in everything, but sometimes we have to take the politics out of it. And we have to be willing, as you all, the Nariva Mayaro Youth Council, as you all have encouraged this afternoon, where you have brought persons from multiple agencies to sit down and simply just have a conversation, and not a debate, not an argument, not a heated where this one vex and that one vex. No, where we're able to have a conversation about crime. And I want in my so again, it's just a lot if I go to speak about what the government has been doing, but I want to remind the young people that the policies are there. You equally have to take social responsibility. You have to find out what is available. You have to avail yourself to these programs and not simply sit by and wait for money to, I had a conversation with some of my young team members recently, and I said, sometimes I often wonder if because I was talking about my children, I was talking about my personal experience in dealing with my children. I say, sometimes I just wonder if they really want to work hard for if they really understand what it is to work hard for what you want and for where you want to go. Sometimes I get the impression from my own children that they want to wake up in the morning and just the money hit a bank account and not sweat a day in their life for it. You all, as the young persons in this platform, have to encourage that conversation, reminding young people that they also have to take social responsibility. The programs are there, the policies are there, but you have to be willing to access those opportunities. You have to be willing to take advantage of those opportunities. Critical to the conversation are the NGOs. Critical to the conversation is the opposition. Critical to the conversation on crime are all of the ministries. Critical to the conversation are resources. Reminding our population again, we can only work with the resources that are available. And yes, I think multiple persons at this panel spoke about prioritizing. When we have limited resources, that is the position that we find ourselves in, where we have to prioritize. We don't have money. Money don't fall like manna from the sky. Money don't just appear. We don't have a magic wand for money to appear. We have to use the resources that we do have, prioritize the spending of that money, but equally recognizing that each and every one of us play a critical role in dealing with this crime, with this crime situation. So again, I just want to encourage you all. I am grateful again for being invited to be a part of this dialogue. You continue the excellent work. To similar young groups that are looking on, continue the conversation, play your part, create the hashtags for crime, create the positive hashtags and make it infectious. Let that trend, and as the word you always use, something trending, it's trending now, right? You all use that platform, and again, I congratulate you all for using your platform, not just for bacchanal, not just for banter, but for encouraging positive conversations. And to that extent, again, congratulations to all my colleagues. Certainly, I respect and I salute all of my colleagues who took the time out, opposition, private, the military. I can certainly say what you all will want to do is to encourage the TTPS to also be a part of this conversation, persons from the Director of Public Prosecution's Office to be a part of this conversation, recognizing that we all have a role and a part to play. So to that effect, thank you very much. I know the time is limited. I know it's very late, but thank you most sincerely. And I am so, as a mommy, not just as a politician, as a mommy, I am so proud of you all. Continue the good work.
Much for that, and also happy birthday to your niece. Happy birthday to your niece. So closing remarks, final thoughts, MP Haynes.
Thank you again to you all for hosting an excellent panel. I just wanted to say one of the key elements that we have to look at is examining the effectiveness of whatever it is that we're doing and the efficiency. And so while I accept Senator Sooklal's the programs that have been put on the table and certainly all that is being done, if we aren't examining the effectiveness, if we're not monitoring whether or not these things are working, because at the end of the day, with all of those things in place, we crossed 600 murders, violent crime. With all of these things in place, and that is not to disregard that things will take time, but as everyone stated earlier today, throughout our 2-hour discussion, is that these things have been happening and getting progressively worse over time. And so therefore we don't need to start over. We don't need to restart a conversation. We need to, I think, Mr. Wilson, Lieutenant Commander Dindial, they've all said it, those persons who work in the field. And I mean, just for full disclosure, I'm from a policing family, right? My dad is TTPS. And so I hear these things all the time as to, listen, there are people in society who know exactly what needs to be done. They live it every single day. And ensuring that we then put the necessary backing to get things in place and examining our effectiveness. I think what a lot of persons who come onto these programs want to hear, they want to hear that we understand the problem, we propose the solution, and then we examine the solutions that we've proposed, because society is ever evolving, things will always change. And that's how we'll see the difference and we'll make the difference. And I want to echo Senator Sooklal and certainly everyone else here who spoke about this type of conversation, and applauding the youth group for putting together a panel, because a key part of why I find myself in the political landscape is ensuring that there is access to policymakers, so that persons like Mr. Wilson and Mr. Cunningham do not feel like they will not be heard and their spaces are not recognized, because we have to connect with each other. And therefore, the accessibility to members of parliament, members of both houses, to the executive, so that you know you understand that when we say we are working together, we mean it literally and not figuratively. Because for far too long, that has been a very figurative conversation. We're working together, and what does it mean? You never see me. You have no idea what I look like from outside of the TV, but I'm telling you, we are working together. And so here we are with the panel discussion, with a youth forum, with persons in the youth category being the organizers, spearheading the conversation. And once we continue to do that, we'll find ourselves in a better place. Once we continue to connect, and once we start to take the idea of working together literally and not figuratively, we'll make a difference.
Thank you, MP Haynes, and thank you to all of the panelists. Throughout our discussion, we have explored various aspects of crime, including its cause, the impact it has on society, and possible solutions. Our panelists have provided a wealth of knowledge through these provoking ideas, and I think something that came out of tonight's discussion is that we definitely all may be on board for part 2. Because it is warranted for such a large panel. It is really warranted. As we come to the end of this panel, I would like to remind our audience that the fight against crime is an ongoing effort that requires the collective effort of individuals, communities, just everybody that lives within Trinidad and Tobago. It's not just the government, it's not just the opposition, and the independent bench, and then the police and the judiciary. No, it takes each and every one of us. It is only through our shared commitment to justice and the rule of law that we can create a safer and better society. I want to shout out a few persons who, I know that they don't know I'm about to do this, but I want to congratulate and commend Samantha for co-hosting with me. Thank you so much. I also want to shout out the Trinidad Youth Council, and of course the organ of that, which is the Nariva Mayaro Youth District, that would have put together this tonight's proceedings. Of course, we want to shout out the chairman of the Nariva Mayaro Youth District, Mr. Patrick Phillips, who was very much involved in this discussion and this topic, and somebody very important that I know each one of us had at some point to interact with. The man behind the scenes, Mr. Christian Bidisi. And I know he doesn't get the big up that he deserves, right? He doesn't get the big up. So congratulations to all of you all that would have been behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, and assisting where you can, and really, as Keon said, adding your voice and using that utilized innate ability to champion for good. Senator Sooklal, Sagramsingh Sooklal, she would have mentioned that we would have brought together a panel of persons from all different, maybe walks of life, but even political divides. We even had somebody not just from the government, not just from the opposition, but from a third party come on board. The persons who would have put together this, the young persons who were involved tonight, behind the scenes, myself, Samantha, we ourselves are involved politically. We may be aligned as well, some of us. And so we had to make that sort of assessment when coming to put together this discussion. So I'm glad that you all did it, but we did it as well. Huh? We did it as well. So congratulations, and I look forward to part 2 of this discussion. Very, very interesting. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you. This was I think almost 3-hour-long discussion. So thank you for still staying here with us. For those who are still viewing, thank you for staying with us. And for those who are now looking back at this video, still leave a comment, because we would be utilizing your comments in part 2. So for that, I am Chris Hussein, and we're signing off for tonight. Good night.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Good night,
everyone. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Guys.